Press the pads of your fingertips into the soft place just beneath your collarbone, the small warm hollow where the skin sits thin over the upper edge of the chest, and let them rest there for a moment longer than feels natural. The warmth you feel rising into your own hand is not ordinary warmth. It is not blood flow alone, and it is not the residual heat of the room around you, and it is not, as the older anatomy books once insisted, simply the surface of muscle and skin. It is the signature of a specific tissue that almost no adult male body carries in the same quantity, a specialized brown and beige adipose depot that the female body retains across the upper chest, along the sides of the neck, in the small of the back between the shoulder blades, around the great vessels of the mediastinum, and in the deep wrap of fascia around the kidneys. That tissue is one of the oldest survival technologies on Earth. It was not designed in a laboratory, it was not refined in a clinic. It was engineered, slowly and brutally and with extraordinary precision, in the bodies of women who carried your mitochondrial line through a span of roughly 30,000 winters, in a climate that would kill a modern adult in 2 unprepared nights. You were not told this in school. You were told, if you were told anything at all, that the Ice Age was a backdrop, a setting, a cold curtain behind which men in fur hoods hunted mammoths with stone-tipped spears. You were shown dioramas with snow and torches and men in the foreground. You were not shown the women. You were not shown the bodies in which the species was actually being kept alive across that long freeze. You were not shown the tissue under your own collarbone, and you were not told that the tissue is the surviving fingerprint of an engineering project so old and so successful that no piece of modern medicine has improved on its basic design. The Ice Age was not, in any honest reading of the evidence, a backdrop. It was the largest sustained selection event in the history of the female form, and the form that emerged from it is the form that you have been carrying, without instructions, every day of your life. The counterfact that opens this evening is sharper than most accounts are willing to make it. The cold did not punish women. The cold selected them, and it selected them in ways that selected men differently, less precisely, and with less long-term consequence. Across the deep glacial pulse that paleoclimatologists call marine isotope stage 3 and the more brutal marine isotope stage 2 that followed it, a window running roughly from 57,000 to 12,000 years before the present, the women who survived to pass on their mitochondria were the women whose bodies had quietly rewritten themselves into thermal machines. They carried more brown adipose tissue per kilogram of body weight than their male partners. They cooled their hands and feet faster and earlier in a cold exposure, sacrificing the periphery to defend the deep core where a future child might one day grow. They menstruated less frequently across a single lifetime than any woman alive in any industrial society does today, because their bodies, sensing famine and frost and the thinning of body fat below a critical threshold, paused fertility for months and sometimes years to keep the woman herself intact. They aged differently. They stored fat differently. They shivered along a different curve. They slept across the long winter dark on a rhythm that modern sleep laboratories have only recently begun to recognize. They dreamed, very probably, on a different schedule. And each one of those adaptations, each one of those quiet structural decisions, is still inside you tonight, still operative under the skin, still doing the work it was built for, whether or not anyone has ever named it for you. What lies in front of us this evening is not a tour of the Ice Age in the usual sense, not a parade of mammoths and cave paintings and famous male hunters with their famous male names. What lies in front of us is something quieter and more exact. A careful, unhurried account of what those 30,000 winters actually did to the female form, organ by organ, layer by layer, season by season, generation by generation. From the women buried at Sungir on the Russian plain 28,000 years ago in fitted parkas sewn with more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, to the women whose hand stencils still rest on the limestone walls of El Castillo in northern Spain, and from those women in an unbroken maternal line of perhaps 800 to 1,000 generations down to the woman with her hand against her own collarbone tonight, listening in the dark to a voice that has been waiting to say this to her. 3 promises shape what follows, and I will state them now so that they can be felt arriving when they arrive. The first promise is that by the end of the second chapter you will understand, in your own body, why women feel cold in their hands and feet before men do, and you will understand it not as a frailty but as the surface signal of the most elegant thermal triage system ever evolved in the primate lineage. That promise will resolve cleanly. The second promise unfolds across the middle chapters, and it concerns the hidden economy of Ice Age women, the spinning and the weaving and the tracking and the gathering and the pharmacological knowledge that fed the band when the hunt failed, which was almost always. That promise resolves later, and it resolves with consequence. The third promise is the one I cannot give you yet. It concerns something the cold did to the female brain that mainstream neuroscience has only begun to measure with confidence in the last decade. It touches memory, it touches grief, it touches the specific way older women in a family hold a whole lineage together with a kind of long arc attention no other mind in the family possesses. That promise I will keep at its proper place, near the 70% mark of this evening, not before. Before we move any further, I want to ask one thing of you, and I will ask it only once tonight. Picture the oldest woman in your direct maternal line that you can still see with your own eyes, not from a photograph on a wall, from memory. Your mother in her last quiet decade, or your grandmother in the half-light of her kitchen, or a great aunt who outlived everyone else and ended her days as the family's last witness, whichever woman arrives in your mind first. Hold her face for a moment. Keep her in the room with us this evening, because everything I am about to tell you about the women of the Ice Age was equally true of her. The same brown fat under her collarbone, the same cold hands she warmed against the side of a cup, the same quiet famine memory written into the way she stored extra food in the backs of cupboards long after she could possibly need to, the same patience with long silences, the same ear for the names of people from 40 years ago. She's not separate from this story. She's the most recent published chapter of it, and what we recover tonight is the longer manuscript she was part of. When, later in the evening or later in the week, you say her name into a quiet room or into a comment box, you are doing the same thing women of our lineage have done in front of small fires for 30,000 winters, which is to keep a name in the air so the line behind it does not vanish. The Ice Age, in the sense we will use it tonight, is not a single event. It is the long oscillation of the late Pleistocene, the cold pulses and brief warmer interstadials that ran from roughly 70,000 to 12,000 years before the present. Within that long oscillation, there were periods when the great ice sheets pushed south to cover what is now Berlin, Warsaw, Kiev, Chicago, Toronto, and the whole of Scotland under a wall of ice more than a kilometre thick. Sea levels dropped by more than 120 metres. The land we now call the English Channel was a frozen plain across which a woman could walk dry-shod from what is now Kent to what is now Calais, with her child on her hip and a pack of dried reindeer meat lashed across her back. The steppe that ran from western France across Central Europe and into Siberia and over the Bering Land Bridge into what is now Alaska was a single immense grassland that specialists call the Mammoth Steppe, and it was on this steppe, in winter temperatures that routinely dropped to -30 and -40 degrees Celsius, that the modern female body was finished. Not built, finished. The bones were already in place. The skeleton of a woman from 60,000 years ago is, to a careful eye, indistinguishable from the skeleton of a woman alive in any modern city. What changed inside the Ice Age was not the bone. It was everything wrapped around the bone. I want to be precise about what I mean by finished, because the precision matters. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens women had existed in Africa for at least 200,000 years before the Ice Age peaks we will discuss this evening. The cranial vault, the pelvis, the long bones, the shape of the hand were essentially modern by 60,000 years ago. What changed during the last glacial maximum and the deep cold pulses around it was not the skeletal scaffolding, but the soft tissue and the systems that ran through it, the fat distribution, the vasculature of the skin and the periphery, the metabolic set points of the hypothalamus, the reproductive timing of the ovary, the immune calibration of the spleen and the bone marrow and the mucosal surfaces, the neuroendocrine response to long seasonal darkness, the reorganization of memory consolidation across the hippocampus and the limbic system. These are the tissues, and these are the systems that do not fossilize. For most of the 20th century, archaeology could see only what fossilized, which meant archaeology saw spear points and skulls, and missed almost everything that mattered most about how women in the Ice Age actually lived inside their own bodies. That changed in the last 25 years, and it changed because three converging fields finally came of age at the same time. Ancient DNA, pioneered out of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig under Svante Pääbo, and then carried forward by his student Johannes Krause, and by the broader generation of ancient genome researchers working between Leipzig, Copenhagen, Harvard, and Vienna. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen and tooth enamel, refined by Michael Richards and his colleagues across Max Planck and the University of British Columbia, which now allows us to reconstruct the diet of an individual woman who died 25,000 years ago from a single tooth. And the bioarchaeology of women specifically, a discipline that barely existed before the work of scholars who insisted, against considerable institutional resistance, that the female skeleton be read on its own evolutionary and biomechanical terms, rather than as a smaller, lighter, somehow incomplete version of the male. What those three fields together have made visible is the project of this script. 30,000 winters did not leave the female body unchanged, and the changes are still operative in you. The cold hand you tuck under the opposite arm in a cool room is the same gesture an Oronation woman made 28,000 years ago beside a hearth on the Don River. The way your appetite rises in the first cool weeks of autumn and your sleep deepens in the long winter dark is the same circannual rhythm her body ran on. The way your bones thinned after menopause and your fat redistributed slowly toward the trunk is the same redistribution that allowed an Ice Age grandmother to survive into her 60s when most adult men of her band did not see 40. None of this is metaphor. None of it is poetic license. All of it is mechanism, and every mechanism we are about to walk through can be named, located, measured, and traced backward through a chain of evidence that runs from the imaging suite at Karolinska to the open-air site at Pavlov in Moravia to the bone tool drawers of a regional museum in southwest France. If you stay with me from this opening through to the final sentence of the conclusion, you will leave the evening with a different relationship to your own body. Not a younger relationship, not a fitter relationship, a more ancient one. The kind of relationship that recognizes the cold hands and the autumn hunger, and the quiet endurance and the long memory pattern recognition of older women not as flaws to be corrected, not as deficits to be supplemented, not as signs that something has gone slightly wrong, but as the surviving signal of an inheritance that was tested for 30,000 winters and was not found wanting. That is what we are about tonight. Let us begin where the cold begins, which is at the skin, in the half-millimetre boundary between the woman and the world, where the entire long argument of the Ice Age first wrote itself into the female form. Chapter 1. The first thing the cold touched was the surface, not the bones, not the womb, not the brain in its deeper architecture, but the skin itself, and the thin layer of fat just beneath it, and the small vessels that ran through both. To understand what those 30,000 winters did to the female body, we have to begin at the boundary between the woman and the world, because that boundary was the first line of defence, the first laboratory of change, and the first place where the cold left a measurable, lasting, inheritable signature. There is a measurement that bioarchaeologists and physiologists now agree on, and it is a measurement that very few women have ever been told. The average modern woman of European, North Asian or Northern Circumpolar maternal descent carries roughly 10% more subcutaneous fat than the average modern man of the same descent, and that fat is distributed in a pattern that no other primate displays. It pools across the hips, the thighs, the buttocks, the upper arms, and the lower abdomen in a configuration that physiologists call gynoid distribution, and that distribution is not, as the 20th century insisted with disturbing confidence, primarily a sexual signal aimed at the male eye. It is a thermal blanket. It is a famine reserve. It is, above all, an infant protection system. The cold made it. The cold kept it. The cold tuned it across 1,000 generations of women whose surviving children went on to produce the next generation of women whose surviving children produced you. And the configuration is on your body tonight. Consider what a woman's body had to do in late January, on the open Mammoth Steppe, in a wind chill of -45 degrees Celsius, with a nursing infant pressed against her chest inside a fur parka stitched from reindeer hide. The infant could not shiver effectively, because shivering thermogenesis matures only slowly in human babies and is essentially absent in the first months of life. The infant could not vasoconstrict its own peripheral vessels with any precision. The infant's brain, which was already consuming somewhere on the order of 60% of the child's total metabolic budget, had to be kept within a thermal window of less than 2 degrees Celsius around its core, or it would suffer immediate and lasting damage. Every gram of warmth that infant received in the worst hours of the cold came from its mother's body, Not from the fire, which was outside the parka. Not from the fur, which only slowed the loss of heat already produced. From her. From the vascularized, fat-rich band of tissue across her chest, her upper arms, and the inner surface of her thighs, where the infant rode when she walked. The women whose bodies could hold that heat across a winter raised children. The women whose bodies could not did not. That is the brutal arithmetic of the last glacial maximum, and the gynoid fat pattern is its surviving fingerprint on the body of every one of her granddaughters, down to and including the woman listening to this voice. Run the flat of your hand along the outside of your thigh now, from the crest of the hip down to a point just above the knee. The slight thickening you feel under the skin there, the layer that has a different density and a different give from the layer on the front of the thigh or the back of the calf, is the lateral subcutaneous adipose pad. It has a peculiar metabolic property that the equivalent depots in the male body do not share. It is slow, it is metabolically resistant. It does not respond to short-term caloric restriction the way visceral abdominal fat does. Women who diet aggressively lose abdominal fat first, and lateral thigh fat almost last, and this is not a cosmetic inconvenience invented to torment the modern dieter and to sell magazines. It is an Ice Age guarantee. That pad was the last reserve. It was what kept a woman alive through the worst stretch of late winter, the stretch the archaeologists call the lean season. When the stored meat from autumn was gone, the spring herds had not yet returned, and the band lived for weeks on the marrow scraped from already cracked bones and on whatever the women could dig from beneath the snow. Men in that situation lost weight faster and died sooner. Women in that situation lost weight more slowly and lived. The fat that women today are taught to apologize for is the fat that wrote our lineage into the present tense, and the apology is 6 millennia of cultural confusion superimposed on an inheritance that does not deserve it. The skin itself changed too, and this is where the story becomes more specifically female in ways that mainstream histories rarely take time to note. Across the late Pleistocene, in the populations that pushed and held north of roughly 40 degrees latitude, 2 pigmentation alleles spread rapidly through the gene pool. The variant of SLC2405 that lightened skin pigmentation, along with related variants at SLC45A2 and TYR, reached high frequency in European populations sometime between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. Work by Ian Matthieson at the University of Pennsylvania and by collaborators of David Reich at Harvard, drawing on ancient DNA from more than 1,000 European individuals across a 30,000-year window, has shown that the spread of these alleles was strongly directional and almost certainly under selection, and that the selection pressure was felt more sharply in women than in men. The reason is vitamin D. A woman in late pregnancy and a woman nursing an infant has a vitamin D demand roughly 40% higher than a non-pregnant adult, and on the mammoth steppe in winter, with the sun low and weak and the skin covered by fur for 9 months of the year, vitamin D synthesis collapsed. Women whose skin let through more ultraviolet light in the brief uncovered summer hours produced more vitamin D, calcified their own bones and the bones of the children inside them more reliably, and watched fewer of their infants die of rickets and tetany in the second winter of life. The lighter skin of northern women is, at its root, an Ice Age reproductive adaptation, driven by the metabolic demands of the female body rather than the male. It was a child survival trait, written into the most visible tissue of the human body, where the modern world spent most of the 20th century misreading it as something else entirely. There is a moment in the archaeological record that I want to bring you into because it is one of the few moments where the soft tissue story leaves a physical trace dramatic enough to be photographed. In 1955, a Russian archaeologist named Otto Bada, working on a tributary of the Klyazma River, about 200 kilometers east of Moscow, opened the burial pit known today as Sungir II and Sungir III. 2 children buried head to head, and beside them, in a separate grave, the burial known as Sungir I, an older man. Radiocarbon work refined across the following decades, most recently by the team around Eric Trinkos at Washington University in St. Louis, places these burials at approximately 34,000 years before the present, deep inside the early Upper Paleolithic. The 2 children had been laid out with more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads sewn onto fur clothing that had long since rotted away, leaving only the bead patterns to indicate the precise shape of the garments. The garments were hooded parkas, fitted trousers, soft inner caps and embroidered boots, tailored, sewn and beaded by hand. Each individual bead took according to modern experimental reconstruction by skilled beadworkers using replica flint drills and mammoth ivory, between 45 minutes and an hour to drill. 10,000 beads represent something on the order of 10,000 human hours of labour, and that labour was almost certainly performed by women, because in every documented forager society of the historical period, the fine sewing and the bead production has been women's work. What the Sungir burials tell us, in the bluntest possible terms, is that 34,000 years ago, on the cold edge of the European steppe, women had already engineered the technological system that would carry the species through the worst of what was coming. The system was tailored, layered, fitted clothing, and it was the second skin that allowed the first skin to keep its blood. I want to bring you back to your own body for a sentence, because the abstraction is about to become specific in a way you can feel. The reason your hands feel cold before the rest of you does, the reason a woman in a cool office reaches for a cardigan while the man across the desk from her loosens his collar, is not that women are more fragile or more weather sensitive or more prone to complaint. It is that the female autonomic nervous system, calibrated across those 30,000 winters, vasoconstricts the peripheral vessels in the hands and feet at a higher core temperature threshold than the male system does. The body's making a deliberate, conserved, evolved decision. It is closing the gates to the fingers and the toes early, before the deep core has cooled, in order to keep the uterus, the ovaries, the kidneys, and when present the fetus, inside a narrow thermal window. A man's body waits longer to close those gates because his body has no womb to protect. The cold hand is not a malfunction. It is a triage protocol that worked, generation after generation, for as long as the ice held, and the protocol is still installed in the woman whose hand is on the back of her own neck right now, feeling for the small warm hollow above the spine where another brown fat depot waits. Quiet, ready, exactly where the cold left it. By the time you finish this chapter, I want one thing to have settled into you. The female surface, the skin and the fat just beneath it, and the small vessels that run through both, is the most heavily edited tissue in the human body. And the editor was the Ice Age. Every layer of you that you have been told to apologise for, the soft outer thigh, the cold fingertips, the slow to mobilise hip reserve, the pale winter skin that burns and freckles in July, is a paragraph in the editor's manuscript. None of it is decoration, none of it is failure. All of it is engineering, and the engineering still works. And we have not yet left the surface. We have not yet gone inside where the deeper changes wait, where, for instance, an organ that no anatomy textbook published before 2009 even acknowledged adult women carry in significant quantity, was quietly burning calories in the upper chest of every Ice Age mother who ever survived a January night. That organ is where we go next, and what it does inside you, right now, as you sit listening, will change how you understand every cold morning of your life. Chapter 2. Brown adipose tissue. For most of the 20th century, the medical consensus was that adult humans did not have it in any biologically significant quantity. Infants had it, the textbooks acknowledged, in a small pad between the shoulder blades and around the kidneys, and it dwindled, the textbooks said, as the child grew. By adulthood, the consensus held, the tissue was vestigial, a leftover, a curiosity, evolutionarily interesting but functionally negligible. That consensus collapsed in 2009 when 3 independent research groups working on 3 different continents and unaware of one another's near-simultaneous results published almost on top of each other in the New England Journal of Medicine. The group at the Joslin Diabetes Centre in Boston was led by C. Ronald Kahn. The group at Maastricht University in the Netherlands was led by Wouter van Marken Lichtenbelt. The group at Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm was led by Sven Ennebeck. Using positron emission tomography, combined with computed tomography, and a radio-labelled glucose tracer that lights up metabolically active tissue, the 3 teams demonstrated separately and convergently that adult humans carry active, responsive, hormonally regulated brown adipose tissue in specific anatomical depots across the lifespan. They demonstrated that the tissue's activity increases dramatically when the body is exposed to mild cold. They demonstrated that the tissue declines with age but does not disappear. And crucially for what we're doing tonight, they demonstrated that women carry significantly more of it than men do, and that women retain it later into life. 3 papers in 1 journal in 1 year. The textbooks have been rewritten because of them. The story of how the female body survived the Ice Age has been rewritten because of them. even if most of the women who carry that body have not yet heard the rewrite. Brown fat is unlike the white fat we discussed in the previous chapter, and the difference is not a matter of degree. White fat stores energy in lipid droplets for later use. Brown fat burns it on the spot as heat. The cells of brown adipose tissue are packed with mitochondria, and those mitochondria carry an unusual protein in the inner membrane called uncoupling protein 1, abbreviated UCP1, which short-circuits the normal cellular pathway that produces chemical energy. Instead of producing ATP, the chemical currency that cells use to do mechanical and biochemical work, the mitochondria of a brown adipocyte release the energy of the burned fatty acid directly as heat. A single gram of fully activated brown adipose tissue can produce, by some estimates, up to 300 times more heat per minute than a gram of any other tissue in the body. It is, in the most literal and unsentimental sense, a biological furnace. And the depots where these furnaces sit in the adult female body are precisely the depots that protect the organs most critical to reproduction and to the survival of an infant pressed against the mother's chest. The supraclavicular depot above the collarbone, the paraspinal depot along the cervical and upper thoracic spine, the periorenal depot wrapping the kidneys, the mediastinal depot in the upper chest cavity, the axillary depot in the armpit, each one a small furnace, each one positioned to warm blood on its way to a core organ, each one positioned in the parka of an Ice Age mother walking against the wind, to keep the chest cavity warm enough that the child against her body could draw warm breath and warm milk in the same minute. The sex difference in brown fat is not subtle and not contested. A comprehensive review published in 2018 by André Carpentier at the Université de Sherbrooke in Quebec, pulling together imaging data from more than 1,100 adults across a dozen separate clinical studies, found that women carry on average between 30 and 50% more active brown fat by volume than age-matched men. The difference persists into the 60s and 70s. Women in their late 60s still show measurable, metabolically active brown adipose tissue on PET imaging, while age-matched men have largely lost it. Part of the reason is hormonal. Estrogen receptors are densely expressed in brown adipocytes, and estrogen upregulates the production of UCP1. Part of the reason is structural. Female brown fat depots are organized in a slightly different topology, with a denser vascular supply and a more extensive sympathetic nerve network. But the deeper reason is selection. The Ice Age did not need male bodies to thermoregulate as precisely as it needed female bodies to. A man whose core temperature dropped a degree overnight could shiver in his sleep, eat more in the morning, and recover by midday. A woman whose core temperature dropped a degree overnight while a newborn nursed against the inside of her parka frequently lost the newborn. The selection pressure on female thermogenesis was not equal to the selection pressure on male thermogenesis. It was greater. And brown fat is what that pressure produced, generation after generation, until the tissue became one of the defining biological differences between the adult female and the adult male body in cold-adapted populations. I want to ground this in a specific place and a specific woman, because the mechanism only becomes real when the body becomes real. In 1969, a Czech archaeologist named Bohuslav Klima, working at the open-air site of Dolní Věstonice in southern Moravia, recovered the burial of a young woman now catalogued as Dolní Věstonice III, dated to approximately 26,000 years before the present. The site itself, a Gravettian mammoth hunter encampment near the modern town of Mikulov, has produced some of the most extraordinary evidence we have of Ice Age life. It produced the ceramic figurine called the Venus of Dolní Věstonice, the oldest known fired ceramic object in the world, baked in a small domed kiln at around 29,000 years before the present, almost certainly by a woman, almost certainly inside one of the small huts whose post holes the excavators carefully mapped across the muddy surface of the site. The young woman in Burial 3 had been laid on her side, her body partially covered with red ochre, with a fox-tooth necklace at her throat, and the bones of an Arctic fox arranged carefully at her feet. Stable isotope analysis of her bone collagen, carried out by Michael Richards and his colleagues and published in 2001, showed a diet extraordinarily rich in animal protein and animal fat, with significant contributions from freshwater fish and from the large herbivores of the steppe. Her bone density, despite her relative youth, showed the unmistakable signs of repeated metabolic stress, the kind of stress that comes from cycling between feast and famine across multiple winters in succession. She had survived several of those winters. Her body had been a furnace that the cold had not yet succeeded in extinguishing. The brown fat that almost certainly insulated her vital organs left no direct trace in her bones, because soft tissue does not fossilize, but the isotopic record of her metabolism, the careful arrangement of her grave, the red ochre laid across her hips and shoulders, and the small carved tokens placed beside her body tell us that the people who buried her understood in their own vocabulary what she had been. She had been a woman who held heat. In the Gravetian, that capacity was holy, and the holiness was practical. The woman who held heat was the woman whose children survived. Bring your attention again to the small warm hollow beneath your collarbone. The depot of brown fat that sits there is, in most women, roughly the size of a thumbprint, slightly larger in women who live in cold climates or who regularly expose themselves to cool air or cold water, slightly smaller in women who spend their lives in centrally heated indoor environments where the body has not been asked to defend its temperature for years on end. The tissue is responsive. The tissue can be grown. The Maastricht group under Van Marken-Lichtenbelt, following healthy volunteers through carefully designed 10-day protocols of mild cold exposure at around 15 degrees Celsius for several hours per day, demonstrated measurable increases in both the volume and the metabolic activity of supraclavicular brown fat within 2 weeks. The tissue has not gone away in us. It is simply quieter in centrally heated lives, the way an instrument left in a case for years is still an instrument, and still able to play when it is opened and warmed up again. The tissue has a side effect that the 2009 discovery teams noted with some excitement and that the popular press largely missed. Women with more active brown adipose tissue have, on average, better insulin sensitivity, lower fasting glucose, lower fasting insulin, and lower lifetime rates of type 2 diabetes than women with less active brown fat. The same furnace that kept an Ice Age mother alive across a January night is, in your body tonight, still helping to regulate the blood sugar that drives the energy you're using to remain awake and attentive, while a calm voice in the dark walks you through your own architecture. The cold did not only engineer survival. The cold engineered metabolic resilience that the great-great-granddaughters of those Ice Age mothers are still living off 12,000 years after the ice retreated from the European plain. Here is where the first promise of the script resolves, and I want it to resolve cleanly so we can move on without coming back to restate it. The reason women feel cold in their hands and feet before men do, the reason the female body is built to vasoconstrict its periphery earlier and more aggressively, is not weakness, is not poor circulation, is not a deficit to be corrected with supplements or thicker socks alone. It is the surface expression of a deep architecture. The architecture closes the gates at the fingers and toes in order to keep the deep core where the brown fat furnaces sit and where the reproductive organs sit inside a narrow thermal envelope. The cold hand is the visible end of an invisible system that protects the womb, the ovaries, the kidneys, the heart, the adrenal glands, and when present, the fetus. The system was built by 30,000 winters of natural selection on women who needed to keep a child alive in a fur parka in a snowstorm. The system is still operative in you. When your hands are cold and the rest of you is not, your body is doing precisely what it was engineered to do, and the engineering is older than agriculture, older than writing, older than every empire that has ever risen and fallen on the surface of this planet. That is the first promise resolved. The second promise, the one concerning the hidden economy of Ice Age women, the spinning and weaving and tracking and gathering and pharmacological knowledge that fed the band when the hunt failed, begins in the chapter that follows, and it begins not with the body but with the hand, with what the hand was holding while the cold was being survived. Because the cold did not survive itself. Women worked through it, and the work they did has been hiding in plain sight in the archaeological record for more than a century, mislabelled, miscatalogued, miscredited, and quietly written out of the popular story. We are going to give it back its real name. Chapter 3. There is a category of artifact that until very recently almost every archaeology textbook simply called bone-awls. Slender pointed tools polished by long use, found in their thousands across Upper Paleolithic sites from the Pyrenees to the Urals, dated from around 35,000 to 12,000 years before the present. For most of the 20th century, the function of these tools was treated as obvious, in a way that obviousness usually conceals an unexamined assumption. They were for piercing hides, they were for sewing, they were domestic, and domestic was assumed to mean minor. The men, the textbooks implied without quite needing to say it, were doing the important work with the spear points and the burins and the carefully napped chisels and the great projectile blades of the solutrean. The women, when they were mentioned at all, were doing the sewing, in the background, off to the side, in a kind of perpetual ethnographic shadow. Then, in 2009, a paper appeared in the journal Science by Elido Kvavadze, working with Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard, and a team excavating a cave called Dzudzwana in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in the country of Georgia, and what that paper described shifted the foundation of how the field now thinks about Ice Age labour. The Dzudzwana team had been examining cave sediments dated to between 36,000 and 32,000 years before the present, deep in the Aurignacian, and they had found something that the bone awls had been making. Twisted, knotted, dyed flax fibres. Real fibres. Microscopically preserved, in some cases more than 5 centimetres long, twisted clockwise and counterclockwise to produce 2-ply cordage, and stained with at least 4 distinct pigments including a black derived from oak gall and a turquoise blue, whose precise chemical source has still not been pinned down to a single plant or mineral. 36,000 years ago, in a cave above a Georgian river valley, women were spinning wild flax into thread, dyeing the thread in multiple colours, and almost certainly weaving the thread into textiles. Not skins, not hides, textiles. The mental image of the Ice Age woman draped in fur was not wrong, but it was radically incomplete. Beneath the fur, against the skin where it counted, there was cloth, and the cloth was coloured, and the colouring required a working knowledge of mordants and of plant chemistry, and of the seasonal timing of harvest that no 20th century reconstruction of the Aurignacian had imagined women possessing. Once a researcher knows to look for it, the evidence is suddenly everywhere. At Dolny Vestonets and the neighbouring site of Pavlov in Moravia, the work of Olga Soffer at the University of Illinois and James Adovasio at Mercyhurst University, published in a series of papers across the late 1990s and the early 2000s, identified the impressions of woven textiles pressed into wet clay that had then been fired in the same small kilns that produced the famous ceramic figurines. The impressions show plain weave, twill weave, and even open-work netting. Some of the impressions are fine enough to suggest fabric counts of dozens of threads per centimetre, comparable to a modern linen sheet. The famous female figurines from these sites, the so-called Venus figures that filled the imagination of 19th and early 20th century male archaeologists with assumptions about Paleolithic sexuality, turn out, when examined with this new evidence in hand, to be wearing things. The Venus of Willendorf, dated to around 29,000 years before the present, and now in the Natural History Museum in Vienna, has on her head not a strange knobbled cap, as long supposed, but the careful representation of a woven or netted hat. The Venus of Lespugue, from the French Pyrenees, has across her hips the unmistakable depiction of a string skirt, the same garment that ethnographers documented on women across northern Eurasia into the early 20th century, a garment whose only function is to mark, by its swaying, the reproductive status and the moving body of the woman who wears it. The figurines were not, as much of the early 20th century insisted with embarrassing confidence, pornographic objects made by men for men. They were in many cases portraits of clothed and ornamented women, very probably made by women themselves, and the clothing they depicted was the product of a textile technology that had been invented, refined, and transmitted entirely outside the visible male economy of the hunt. I want to pause here and bring you into your own life for a moment, because the second promise of the script is beginning to take shape, and I want it to take shape against something you already know in your own hands. If you have ever knitted, or crocheted, or sewn, or done any of the handwork that has historically been called women's work, you have been using motor pathways and pattern recognition systems that were polished in the female brain across at least 36,000 years. The fine bilateral coordination of the two hands, the sustained low arousal attention to repetitive but variable patterns, the ability to hold a complex three-dimensional structure in mind while working its two-dimensional manifestation. These are not generic human capacities. They are capacities that selection sharpened, preferentially, in the women whose work kept their children alive. If your grandmother could knit a sock without looking at her hands while she talked to you about something completely unrelated, she was demonstrating an Ice Age cognitive specialization that ran in an unbroken neurological line back to the women of Dzudzwana, spinning flax in a cave above a Georgian river. The specialization is still in your hands tonight if you choose to use it, and the use of it is not a hobby. It is the activation of a system the brain was built to run. The economy that this textile technology supported was not minor. It was, by calorie and by survival weight, larger than the hunt. Louis Binford's work in the 1970s and 1980s, then refined and extended by Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, across the 1980s and 1990s, established what is now called the grandmother hypothesis and the broader gathering hypothesis. Together they hold that in foraging societies of the kind that occupied the late Pleistocene steppe, between 60 and 80% of total calories consumed by the band came not from large game hunting, but from plant foods, small game, fish, eggs, insects, shellfish where available, and the gathered surplus that women and older children produced day after day. The hunt was high status. The hunt was dramatic. The hunt failed most of the time. A widely cited 1986 study of the Hadza of Tanzania by Hawkes and James O'Connell, frequently used as an ecological analogue for late Pleistocene foraging because of the similar grassland environment, found that adult male hunters returned from a full day's hunt with no meat at all on roughly 97% of days. The other 3% of days fed the band spectacularly. The other 97% of days depended entirely on what the women had brought back in nets and bags and on what the older women had stored, dried, processed, and pickled against the lean months. Project that pattern back onto the mammoth steppe, where the winter was harsher and the failure rate of the hunt almost certainly higher because of the difficulty of approaching large game across open ground without cover, and a different economic picture of the Ice Age emerges. The Ice Age was not fed by spears. It was fed by women's gathering bags, women's snares, women's drying racks, women's textile-bound storage caches, and women's encyclopedic knowledge of which plants could be eaten in which season and which would kill you if you mistook one for the other. That last knowledge, the pharmacological knowledge of an Ice Age woman, is something we have only begun to recover in detail, and we have recovered it almost entirely from a substance that no archaeologist of the early 20th century would have thought to examine: dental calculus. The hardened plaque that builds up on teeth and that survives in burials, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, traps microscopic plant remains, starch grains, phytoliths, pollen, and even residual DNA. Work by Karen Hardy at the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies, first published in 2012 and refined and extended since, examined dental calculus from 5 Neanderthal individuals at El Cidrón in northern Spain, dated to around 50,000 years ago, and found chemical signatures of yarrow and chamomile, two plants with virtually no nutritional value and significant medicinal properties. Yarrow staunches bleeding, chamomile reduces inflammation and induces sleep. The individuals who chewed these plants were not chewing them for calories, they were using them. The depth of the pharmacological inheritance extends backward across at least the last 75,000 years, and probably much further, and the women of the Upper Paleolithic carried it forward, refined it, expanded it as they moved into new ecologies, and passed it down through the female line in a continuous transmission that did not begin to break until the Industrial Revolution forced rural healing traditions underground in much of Europe. Every herb your grandmother knew the use of, every poultice she could assemble from memory, every steeped infusion she put together when someone in the house had a cold or a cramp or a fever, was the surviving tale of a knowledge tradition that was already very old when the ice was at its deepest. What did a day actually look like for a woman of the Gravettian on the steppe? It looked something like this. Up before full light, because winter nights ran 16 hours or more and the waste of daylight was the waste of life itself. Out from the bone and hide hut, the kind whose remains have been excavated at Mežurice in what is now Ukraine, where the structural frame of the dwelling was made of more than 90 mammoth tusks and skulls, and the whole structure was sized for a small extended family of 6 to 10 people. Snares to be checked, set the previous evening for Arctic hare and ptarmigan, and the smaller predators that came in close after dark. The first run of water from an unfrozen seep, or from the melted ice pot that had been kept against the fire overnight. Children to be fed from the previous night's dried meat, and from whatever stored roots and seeds the autumn had laid into the cache pits. Fibre to be spun while walking, because the spindle and distaff together allow a woman to make thread continuously with her hands, while her feet move and her eyes scan the snow ahead of her for tracks, and her ears listen for the distant calls of the band's other members. skins to be scraped, a job whose toll on female elbow joints and lower back vertebrae is so consistent across forager skeletal populations that bioarchaeologists can identify habitual hide workers in skeletal collections by the wear pattern alone. Margaret Cox and Simon Mays in the United Kingdom, in their long collaborative work on what they call activity-induced skeletal markers, have shown that female skeletons from forager populations across northern Eurasia consistently show enthesopathies, the small ridges and roughenings at muscle attachment points on the right elbow, the right shoulder, and the lumbar spine, consistent with daily prolonged hide scraping carried out for hours at a time across decades of a working life. The work was not glamorous, the work was not optional, the work was constant, and without it, no Parker, and without the Parker, no infant survived its second winter. The forward question that this chapter leaves unanswered, the question that will pull us into the next chapter, is this. If the textile economy, and the gathering economy, and the pharmacological economy, and the snaring economy, and the storage economy, and the hide processing economy were all running primarily through women, who was teaching the next generation of girls how to run them? Because the depth of the knowledge implies that no individual woman could have held all of it alone, and the lifespan of an Ice Age woman, while longer than long supposed, was still not long enough to acquire from scratch the full pharmacopoeia of a steppe ecology, and the full motor repertoire of a textile worker, and the full mental map of a gatherer's territory. The transmission had to be intergenerational. It had to be old to young, across at least 3 generations in any given band, and probably 4. And that requirement, as we are about to see, runs us directly into the question of the Ice Age grandmother, who was almost certainly the single most important person in the band, and who has been almost entirely erased from the popular imagination of what the Ice Age looked like. Chapter 4. The Ice Age grandmother is the missing figure of paleoanthropology. For most of the 20th century, the standard reconstruction of an Upper Paleolithic band placed adult men and women in their 20s and 30s at the centre of the scene, children below them, and assumed, almost universally, and almost without challenge, that almost no one lived past 40 years of age. The reconstructions in museum dioramas reflected this assumption faithfully. You will not find, in the older displays at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, at the British Museum in London, at the Naturhistorische Museum in Vienna, or at most of the regional museums of Central Europe, a single grey-haired woman among the painted scenes of mammoth hunts and hearthside life. She is simply not in the picture, and her absence has shaped what every modern audience, including most of the people listening to this voice tonight, imagines automatically when they hear the words Ice Age. The absence is wrong. The figure was there, she was central, and the recovery of her, across the last 25 years of careful bioarchaeology, is one of the great quiet revolutions in our understanding of who actually kept the species alive. The recovery began with Rachel Kaspari at Central Michigan University and Sang-Hee Lee at the University of California, Riverside, whose 2004 paper, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examined the ratio of older adults to younger adults in fossil and skeletal samples across 4 time periods: early hominins, Neanderthals, early Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern humans, later Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern humans. The ratio of individuals who had lived long enough to become grandparents, which Kaspari and Lee operationalized as roughly the biological age of 30 in a population that began reproduction in the late teens, jumped sharply in the later Upper Paleolithic. The increase was not subtle. It was approximately 5-fold. Older adults, and particularly older women, suddenly made up a much larger proportion of the standing population than they had in any earlier human or pre-human group for which we have skeletal data. Kaspari and Lee proposed, and the field has now largely accepted, that this demographic shift was both a cause and a consequence of the cultural explosion we see in the same period. The sudden proliferation of figurative art, of personal ornament, of complex burial practice with grave goods, of long-distance trade in shell and amber and exotic stone over hundreds of kilometres, of musical instruments such as the bone flutes from the Swabian Jura, and of regional artistic traditions distinguishable by style across continental distances. Grandmothers, in their argument and in the elaborations of their argument across the following 2 decades, made the Upper Paleolithic possible by extending the knowledge transmission window across an extra generation, and by freeing reproductive age women from some of the calorie burden of provisioning small children. I want to slow down here. because the implication is one of the most important in the whole script. The cold did not merely select for thermal adaptations in the female body, the cold selected for longevity in the female body specifically. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by Kristen Hawkes across the late 1980s and 1990s and elaborated in dozens of subsequent papers by Hawkes and her collaborators, including James O'Connell and Nicholas Blurton-Jones, holds that the unusual length of the post-reproductive female lifespan in our species, the fact that women routinely live decades past menopause while almost no other primate does anything comparable, is not an evolutionary accident or a side effect of modern medicine. It is an adaptation. A woman who survived into her 50s and 60s in an Ice Age band was an enormous net contributor to the survival of her grandchildren. She gathered, she remembered, she processed food, she held the pharmacological knowledge. She kept the small children alive and warm while her adult daughters were either out gathering or hunting small game, or making textiles in the lengthening summer light, or, critically, pregnant or newly delivered and unable to do heavy work for a season. Her presence in the band raised the survival rate of her grandchildren by a measurable margin in every quantitative analogue we have been able to construct. The selection acted not on her own reproduction, which had ended, but on the reproduction of her daughters and on the survival of her grandchildren. The women whose mothers lived long left more descendants than the women whose mothers died young. Across 30,000 winters, the female post-reproductive lifespan stretched, while the male post-reproductive lifespan, which did not provide the same direct caregiving multiplier for grandchildren, did not stretch in the same way. The sex difference in modern human lifespan, the roughly 5 to 7 years by which women on average outlive men in modern industrial societies, has one of its deepest roots in the Ice Age grandmother and in the indispensable role she played in the survival of the band. I want you to think now, just for a moment, about your own grandmother, or about a great-aunt or an elder neighbour woman from your childhood who served the same function in your life when your grandmother was not available. The woman who taught you something practical that your mother had not had the time or the patience to teach you. The woman who told you a story that you have never quite let go of and that you still hear in her voice when it comes back to you. The woman who knew where things were in the kitchen drawer that nobody else had bothered to learn. The woman whose body in a chair at the head of a family table changed the temperature of the room. That woman was carrying out a role that is older than civilization. The role is not honorific. The role is functional. The Ice Age band relied on her for the survival of its smallest members, and your grandmother, in whatever attenuated, modernized, urbanized form she lived her life, was still performing some recognizable version of the same role when she taught you what she taught you. There has been an unbroken line of grandmothers between the Ori Nation and you, and the line is not a metaphor. It is a literal genealogical relationship with no break, encoded in your own mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that is passed from mother to daughter without recombination, and which can be traced backward through your maternal line to a woman who lived on the African savannah, roughly 150,000 years before the present and forward through every grandmother since. The bioarchaeological record is now sharp enough that we can begin to identify specific Ice Age grandmothers by name, even when their personal names are unknown to us. There is, for example, the woman from Sungir, the occupant of the original burial Sungir one, whose dental wear, bone density, and arthritic changes indicated an age at death of roughly 40 to 50 years, which on the Aurignacian steppe represented the biological equivalent of 70 or 80 in a modern comfortable society. She had been buried with the same lavish bead grave goods as the children alongside her, suggesting a social position equal in dignity to that of the youngest and most precious members of the group. There is the woman from Brno II, in what is now the Czech Republic, dated to roughly 26,000 years before the present, buried with a small ivory figurine that may possibly be a portrait of her own face, and whose age at death was estimated by Trinkas and colleagues at over 40, with skeletal evidence of healed injuries from earlier in her life, of multiple childbirths, and of prolonged manual labour across her working decades. There is, perhaps most movingly, the woman from Saint-Germain-la-Rivière in southwest France, excavated in 1934 and redated in 2006 to around 15,700 years before the present, who had been buried in a stone-lined grave under a low cairn, wearing a necklace of 70 red deer canines, many of which had been imported from regions at least 300 kilometres away from the site of her burial. She had lived into her late 30s or early 40s. The deer teeth had been collected, drilled, perforated, and exchanged across her entire adult life. She had been someone in her band who mattered enough at the moment of her death to be buried with the visible accumulation of a lifetime of relationships and a lifetime of long-distance social ties. The intergenerational transmission of knowledge that the long female lifespan made possible has left its trace in the specific way Upper Paleolithic technology evolved through time. Stone tool technologies in earlier periods, the Acheulean and the Mousterian, had been remarkably stable across hundreds of thousands of years. Hand axes from 1 million years ago look very much like hand axes from 200,000 years ago. Beginning in the Upper Paleolithic, tool traditions began to change much faster, with distinct regional industries appearing, flowering, and being replaced within timeframes of a few thousand years. The Aurignacian, the Gravettian, the Solutrean, the Magdalenian. The acceleration is consistent with a population in which knowledge was no longer being lost at every generational death, because there were now living grandmothers, and to a lesser degree living grandfathers, to bridge the gap when a mother died young, or when a band's accumulated wisdom needed to be carried forward through a famine or a migration. Cumulative culture, in the technical sense used by the anthropologist Joseph Henrich at Harvard, and a generation of cultural evolution researchers, requires demographic depth in order to grow rather than to erode. The Ice Age provided that depth, and the depth was provided disproportionately by women who lived long enough to be elders. The body of the Ice Age grandmother had been modified by the cold in a way I have not yet brought you into, and the modification is one of the most poignant signals the bioarchaeological record offers. Women's bones, after menopause, lose mineral density at a rate that varies considerably across populations and across nutritional regimes. In modern industrial populations, postmenopausal bone loss can become osteoporosis severe enough to cause spontaneous vertebral fractures and hip fractures by the 60s and 70s. In Ice Age and Mesolithic and early Neolithic skeletal populations, postmenopausal women show bone loss too, but at a noticeably slower rate, and the rate correlates with both higher dietary protein and fat intake, and with higher mechanical loading of the skeleton through daily physical labour. The bodies of Ice Age grandmothers, in other words, were protected from the worst of bone loss because they did not stop. They kept walking, they kept carrying, they kept scraping, they kept lifting children onto their hips and reaching up to take meat from the drying frame and squatting to the ground to dig and rising again. The grandmother who taught you to knit in whatever form she came to you was the genetic and physiological descendant of a woman who scraped hides and dug roots and carried grandchildren across a frozen plain at 65, and whose bones did not break because she had not been permitted by her environment to stop. That inheritance is in you. The osteoporosis you may have been warned about in a doctor's office is the modern decoupling of a system that, in its original environment, would have kept your bones strong because you would not have stopped using them in the way the body expected to be used. We are now at the point where the second promise of the script is fully engaged, even if it has not yet fully resolved. The hidden economy of Ice Age women, the spinning and the gathering and the pharmacology and the intergenerational transmission, was not a sidebar to the hunt. It was the substrate of the hunt. It was what made human survival in glacial Europe and Asia possible at all. The hunt was the exclamation point. The women's economy was the sentence that the exclamation point ended. The chapter that follows will take us deeper into one specific dimension of that economy that has been almost completely invisible until the last decade, and that is the question of what Ice Age women knew about their own bodies, their own cycles, their own pregnancies, and the moon and the seasons that ran through them. The knowledge was technical, the knowledge was tracked, and we are beginning to recover the specific physical evidence that they tracked it on bone. Chapter 5. The bone is roughly the size of your forearm. It is the rib of a horse, polished by long use, and it lay for at least 25,000 years in the sediment of a rock shelter at Abri-Blanchard in the Dordogne, in southwest France, until it was excavated in 1911 by the prehistorian Louis Diden. For most of the rest of the 20th century it sat in a museum drawer, catalogued, labelled, and largely forgotten, one more decorated bone among many. Its surface was covered with 69 engraved marks arranged in a serpentine line down the length of the artefact, the marks varying in shape, depth, and orientation in a way that the early excavators considered decorative and aesthetically pleasing and otherwise unworthy of detailed interpretation. Then, in 1972, an American journalist and amateur scholar named Alexander Marshak, working under a Harvard appointment that he had acquired largely on the strength of his earlier work on the cognitive complexity of Stone Age symbols, published a book called The Roots of Civilization. In it he proposed, on the basis of careful microscopic analysis of the Abry-Blanchard marks under variable lighting and under high magnification, that the 69 notches were not decoration. They were a record. Specifically, they were a lunar record, tracking the phases of the moon across roughly 2¼ lunations, with the variations in mark shape and depth corresponding to crescent, half, full, and dark phases of the moon. Marshak's interpretation was contested at the time, and aspects of it remain contested in some specialist quarters today, but the underlying observation that Upper Paleolithic peoples were producing systematically variable mark sequences on portable bone and antler artifacts that map onto identifiable astronomical and biological cycles has only grown stronger across the half-century since. There are now dozens of such artifacts known across Europe, and as far east as central Siberia, ranging from roughly 35,000 to 12,000 years before the present, and the dominant interpretation of the longer sequences, the ones running to between 28 and 35 marks, or to clean multiples of those numbers, is that they track time. The specific time periods most plausibly being tracked, the 28 to 30-day cycles, are the cycles that mattered most to the people who were doing the tracking, which is to say, the women. This is the second promise of the script entering its deepest phase, and I want to be careful with the claim, because the claim is large and the evidence requires precision. The synodic lunar cycle, from new moon to new moon, runs approximately 29½ days. The human menstrual cycle, in the absence of artificial light, hormonal interference, chronic psychological stress, and the metabolic disruptions of an industrial diet, runs approximately the same length, with a strong tendency to entrain to lunar phase in populations that live without electric light. The entrainment was first systematically documented in modern populations by Winifred Cutler at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1970s and early 1980s, whose work showed that women whose cycles were not regular tended to regularize around 29½ days when exposed to controlled light cycles approximating the lunar phases. Women in traditional foraging societies of the historical period, documented across multiple 20th century ethnographies, frequently showed menstrual synchrony with each other and with the lunar cycle, with the band's reproductive age women bleeding together around the dark of the moon and ovulating together around the full. Whether the same pattern held across the late Pleistocene cannot be directly demonstrated, because dental calculus cannot tell us when a woman bled, but the artifactual record of careful tracking on bone of 28 to 30 mark sequences, often with subsequences whose lengths match precisely the variation between menstrual and lunar months, is consistent with women keeping calendars of their own bodies 20,000 years before any written language existed anywhere on the planet. The implications run deep. A woman who tracks her cycle knows when she's fertile. A woman who knows when she's fertile can choose, within the limits available to her, when to risk pregnancy and when not to. A band of women who collectively track their cycles can predict, with reasonable accuracy, when births will occur 7½ lunar months later, and can plan the band's provisioning, its shelter construction, its seasonal migration, and its allocation of caregiving accordingly. The Ice Age band that could time its winter movements to a known birth schedule had a survival advantage over the band that could not. The notched bones of Abry-Blanchard and the dozens of related artifacts across the Upper Paleolithic world are, on the strongest reading of the evidence, the surviving instruments of a reproductive intelligence that women practiced on themselves and on each other for at least 25,000 years before the invention of writing. The intelligence was technical. The intelligence was teachable. The intelligence was passed grandmother to mother to daughter, and it shaped the demographic structure of every band in which it operated successfully. I want to bring you into a moment now. You're 40,000 years older than you were when this chapter began, and you're sitting in a rock shelter on the Vézère River in what will one day be called France. You're perhaps 28 years old. You've had 3 pregnancies. 2 of the children are still alive. Beside you, on the worn floor of the shelter, your mother sits, who is 43 years old, and who is, by the reckoning of your people, one of the elders. She has on her lap a flat, polished piece of mammoth ivory, and she's making a new mark on it with a fine flint blade held between her thumb and forefinger. The mark is small, a hooked curve, distinct from the straight notches that came before it. The new mark indicates the night that the moon has just become full, and indicates also the night that you have begun, for the first time in many months, to feel the tightening across your lower belly that means your body is preparing to bleed again. Your last child was weaned only a moon and a half ago. The fact that your bleeding has returned tells your mother something she will record. The fact that it has returned during this phase of the moon rather than the dark phase tells her something else, something that has to do with how soon the next pregnancy might be allowed. She makes the mark. She does not need to explain it. You have watched her make these marks since you were a child crouched at her elbow, and you have begun, in the past year, to keep your own. The technology you're watching being practiced is older in your line than the language you speak, and it will outlast that language by a margin you cannot imagine. The granddaughters of your granddaughters' granddaughters, 1,000 generations downstream from where you sit, will live in heated rooms in cities that do not yet have names, and will look up at a moon they barely see, and will have forgotten that the moon and the body once kept time together. But you, on this night in this shelter, do not need to be told. The grandmother's role in this body knowledge system was central, and we can now connect the previous chapter's argument cleanly to this one. The Ice Age grandmother was the keeper of the cycle records of the band. She was the woman who remembered which woman in the band had had her first menstruation in which moon, which woman had missed a cycle and was therefore probably pregnant, which woman had stopped bleeding altogether and was therefore moving into the post-reproductive phase that would soon allow her to take up her own grandmother role. The bone calendars were not, in this reading, the work of a single woman recording only her own body. They were the work of band's elder women collectively recording the reproductive state of all the women of the band, including themselves, across multiple years. A band whose grandmothers kept these records well had better birth outcomes, fewer winter starvations of nursing infants, and a more rational migration schedule than a band whose grandmothers did not. The selection acted again, not on bone or fat or muscle, but on knowledge. I want to ask you a question now, and I am going to ask it in a way that will sit with you for the rest of the script. Where are you listening from tonight, and what is the moon doing where you are? Most of us, in centrally lit homes inside cities whose ambient glow erases all but the brightest astronomical objects, have lost contact with that question. The moon could be full above your roof right now, and you might not know it without checking a calendar on a screen. 25,000 years ago, every woman in your direct maternal line could have answered the question without looking up. She felt the moon as her body felt it. She tracked it. She knew by the angle of the crescent in the early evening sky whether her cycle was running on time. If you have an opportunity tonight or this week to step outside after full dark and look at the moon, to notice which phase it is in and where it is in the sky, you will be doing something that your ancestral mothers did as ordinary daily practice for at least 1,000 generations. The noticing is not nostalgia. The noticing is the reactivation of a perception system that the female body was selected for, and that the female body, even in centrally heated lives, still has the latent capacity to perform. There is one further dimension of the cycle tracking economy that I want to introduce before this chapter closes, and it touches on the question of what Ice Age women knew about contraception. The historical record of birth control extends backward only as far as written sources will carry it, which is to say, only as far as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts of roughly 4,000 years ago. But pharmacological contraception, as documented in ethnographic studies of traditional societies across the 20th century, makes use of plants that were available across the Upper Paleolithic world. Silphium, now extinct, was used in the classical Mediterranean and was so prized that it appeared on Cyrenian coins. Queen Anne's lace, also called wild carrot, whose seeds have well-documented anti-fertility properties, demonstrated in modern laboratory studies on rodents, grew across the post-glacial European steppe, and almost certainly across parts of the late Pleistocene steppe in its glacial refugial zones. Pennyroyal, mugwort, and various species of artemisia, all with abortifacient or fertility-suppressing properties at appropriate doses, are documented from European archaeobotanical assemblages across the late Pleistocene, the Mesolithic, and the early Neolithic. The combination of cycle tracking on portable bone and a working knowledge of these plants gave Ice Age women a degree of reproductive autonomy that the modern imagination, conditioned by the historical erasure of women's medical knowledge across the past 2 millennia, has been slow to credit. The autonomy was not absolute. Infant mortality remained brutal. The constraints of band survival remained real. But the autonomy was real, and it was technical, and the technology was held, taught, refined, and protected by women. The chapter closes now on a question that the next chapter is going to need to begin answering. If Ice Age women held this much technical knowledge of their own bodies, and if they held it within a system of intergenerational transmission centred on grandmothers, what happened to that knowledge during the long Holocene transition into agriculture, into walled cities, into written law and male medical institutions, and the gradual erasure of female practitioners from the historical record? The knowledge did not vanish. It went underground. And the place where it stayed alive longest, the place where the Ice Age woman's pharmacopoeia and the bone calendar logic and the grandmother's role all survived in continuous practice into the medieval period and beyond, was the body of the woman called, in the witch-hunting manuals of early modern Europe, the Wise Woman. Her line reaches back through the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age to the Magdalenian shelter on the Vézère in which we have just been sitting. And in the next chapter we will trace the survival of her body knowledge from the retreat of the glaciers to the threshold of the modern world. Chapter 6. There is a sentence I want to give you at the very start of this chapter, because it will reframe everything that follows. The Ice Age did not end. It receded geographically between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 years before the present, as the great northern ice sheets retreated from Europe and North America, and as the global climate stabilised into the warmer interglacial, we still live inside. But the female body that the Ice Age had engineered did not change when the ice retreated. The selection pressures relaxed. The thermal architecture, the brown fat depots, the gynoid fat distribution, the early peripheral vasoconstriction, the extended postmenopausal lifespan, the menstrual entrainment to seasonal light, all of these remained inside the body. Evolution does not undo what it has built when the building is still useful, and the building was, for most of the women who carried it across the Holocene, still useful. The agriculture, the cities, the indoor heating, the artificial light, the processed food are all too recent, by orders of magnitude, to have re-engineered the system. We are still wearing the Ice Age inside our skin. What changed, between the end of the Pleistocene and roughly 5,000 years ago, was not the body but the social structure that surrounded it. And the change of the social structure had consequences for what the female body was permitted to know about itself, to teach to its daughters, and to declare openly in public. The transition to agriculture, beginning in different regions at different times but most intensively in the Fertile Crescent of Western Asia, between roughly 12,000 and 9,000 years ago was, for women, a complicated bargain, and in many ways a poor one. Bioarchaeology has been clear on this question for 30 years, since the landmark work of Mark Cohen at SUNY Plattsburgh and George Armalagus at Emory University, particularly their 1984 edited volume Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, which assembled evidence from multiple sites across multiple continents showing that the early agricultural transition was accompanied by a measurable decline in overall human health, in adult stature, in dental quality, and in bone density. The decline was not evenly distributed between the sexes. Women's bodies, in skeletal samples from early agricultural villages such as Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, excavated initially by James Mellart in the early 1960s and reopened under the direction of Ian Hodder of Stanford University from 1993 through 2018, showed signs of more severe nutritional stress than men's bodies showed at the same site, more iron deficiency anemia, more dental enamel hyperplasia, the characteristic banded grooves that indicate childhood nutritional crisis, more evidence of repeated childbirth at much shorter intervals than the foraging populations whose skeletons preceded them in the same regions, a measurable reduction in average female stature compared with the late Pleistocene and Mesolithic women whose skeletons came before. The shorter birth intervals are especially telling. Foraging women, with mobile lifestyles, prolonged nursing, and contraceptive plant knowledge, typically spaced their children roughly 4 years apart. Early agricultural women, with sedentary lifestyles and access to grain pap that could be used to wean a child off the breast much earlier, spaced their children at intervals of 2 years or less. The female body had not been engineered by 30,000 winters of selection to bear a child every 2 years. It had been engineered for a child every 4. The mismatch shows up in the bones of the earliest farming villages and never quite stopped showing up after that. But the knowledge survived. It survived because it had been held in women's hands and women's voices for 30,000 winters before that, and a few thousand years of village life did not erase what so many winters had laid down. It survived in the figure who appears in the historical record under many names across the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the figure of the midwife, the herbalist, the healer, the wise woman. The earliest written record of such a figure comes from the Sumerian medical tablets of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 4,000 years before the present, where named female practitioners are recorded as overseeing childbirth, treating what we would now call gynecological complaints, and dispensing herbal preparations. Egyptian medical papyri, particularly the Ebers papyrus dated to around 1550 BCE, and the earlier Kahun gynecological papyrus dated to around 1825 BCE, preserve recipes for fertility tests, for contraceptive pessaries made from acacia gum, dates, and honey, whose lactic acid spermicidal action has been independently verified by modern reproductive biologists, and for treatments for uterine prolapse and abnormal bleeding. The treatments are technical. The treatments are written, in many cases, in the voice of women practitioners speaking to other women practitioners. The technical content is consistent with a knowledge tradition that did not begin in Sumer or in Egypt. It was already old when it was first written down, and the women who wrote it were transcribing something they had been taught orally by women who had been taught orally by women whose teaching reached back, in its long, unbroken voice, into the very last centuries of the Ice Age itself. I want to anchor this back in your body for a moment, because the through line is what I care about. The medicines those women used, the herbs and the pessaries and the warm water washes, and the careful palpation of the abdomen for the position of an infant in the womb are continuous with practices that survived in European folk medicine into the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. The midwife your great-great-grandmother may have called, when her own grandmother was being born in some rural village or some city tenement was, in many parts of rural Europe and rural North America, still using preparations and techniques that had a genealogical relationship to the Upper Paleolithic. The relationship was not direct citation, it was transmission. The chain of teaching from grandmother to mother to daughter, sometimes from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, sometimes from elder community woman to younger apprentice, had not broken across the long Holocene transition. The chain had bent, the chain had adapted, incorporated new plants from new ecologies, lost some old ones, gained others. But the chain had not broken. The break, when it came late, and it came hard. The break is what European historians call the witch hunts, and the term itself is misleading because the violence it describes was directed disproportionately at women who held precisely the body knowledge we have been discussing for the past 3 chapters. Between roughly 1450 and 1750 of the Common Era, across Western and Central Europe, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for the crime of witchcraft, and approximately 75 to 80% of them were women. The most thorough recent quantitative work by Lyndall Roper at Oxford in her 2004 book Witch Craze, by Wolfgang Behringer at Saarland University in his cross-European syntheses of regional witch trial archives, and by Brian Levac in his standard general history of the European witch hunts, has shown that the victims were disproportionately older women, frequently widows, frequently women who held some recognised position in the local community as healer, midwife, layer out of the dead, or herbal practitioner. The Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting manual published in 1486 by the Dominican friars Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, devotes long passages to the threat posed by female healers, naming midwives in particular as a category requiring special suspicion because of their access to the secrets of birth and to the bodies of newborn infants. The text is not metaphorical. The text is calling, by category and sometimes by name, for the destruction of the women who held the inherited body knowledge that had come down from the Ice Age. I am giving you this paragraph not to dwell on horror, but to mark precisely what was lost. When the wise women of early modern Europe were burned, hanged, or drowned, the chain of transmission that had run from the Magdalenian cave shelter to the medieval village was cut, in many regions, in a single generation. The herbal pharmacopoeia survived in fragments, in cookbooks, in monastery gardens tended by literate nuns, in the few medical texts written by literate women such as Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, whose Causae et Curae records gynecological knowledge with clear parallels in much earlier traditions. But the integrated practice, the woman who could read a cycle on a notched stick and palpate a pregnancy and prepare a contraceptive and deliver a child and ease a death and lay out a body, was systematically removed from European public life over the course of 3 centuries. Her replacement, the male physician trained in the universities from which women were excluded, did not have her knowledge. He had to rebuild it, badly, slowly, and with enormous and frequently lethal error across the 18th and 19th centuries. Maternal mortality in industrializing Europe actually rose between roughly 1750 and 1900 before it fell again, because the women who had known how to manage birth had been killed or silenced, and the men who replaced them did not yet know what they were doing. The most dramatic illustration is the puerperal fever epidemic of the 19th century lying in hospitals, in which women died in droves of an infection unknowingly carried on the unwashed hands of male physicians who had moved directly from the autopsy room to the delivery ward. Ignaz Semmelweis identified the cause in Vienna in 1847 and was driven out of his profession for saying so. The Ice Age inheritance in the specific form of integrated female body knowledge was nearly lost across 2.5 centuries of organised institutional violence and institutional ignorance. Nearly lost, not entirely. And here is where the chapter turns toward what survives in you. The transmission did not die in every household. In the rural parts of Ireland and Scotland, in the Scandinavian countries, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in the Russian North, across rural North America in immigrant communities, across indigenous communities whose traditions had never been routed through the European witch hunts at all, the chain continued in attenuated form. The recipes your grandmother passed down for a child's croup, the pressure she taught you to apply to a bleeding wound, the way she knew that a particular tea would help with cramps, and a particular poultice would draw out a splinter, and a particular broth was what to make for someone recovering from a fever, were the surviving threads of a fabric that had been mostly torn but not entirely destroyed. Every woman who has ever told her daughter that hot water with honey and lemon and ginger will help her through the first day of her period is participating in a transmission that, while attenuated and stripped of its original cosmological framing, retains an unbroken genealogical link to women who knew the same things 25,000 years ago. The knowledge was not in books for most of its history. The knowledge was in voices, in hands, and in the demonstration of one woman's body to another woman's body. And the knowledge is still, in fragments, alive in you, whether or not you have a name for the fragments you carry. The second promise of the script is now fully resolved. The hidden economy of Ice Age women was not hidden because it did not exist. It was hidden because the institutions that wrote history were the institutions that had, in many cases, broken the chain. The recovery of that economy across the last 50 years of bioarchaeology, ancient DNA, ethnobotany, and the gender archaeology that has insisted on reading female labour with the same seriousness once reserved for male labour, has been the recovery of something the women themselves never lost. Only the men with the pens lost it, and what we have recovered with a clarity that allows us now to turn to the third and deepest of the 3 promises of this evening's script, because there is something the Ice Age did to the female brain, specifically, that the last decade of neuroscience has only begun to be able to measure with confidence. It touches memory, it touches grief, it touches the specific way older women into their 70s and 80s hold a family's stories together and pass them on. It is not metaphor, it is mechanism, and it is what the next chapter and the one after exist to bring you into. Chapter 7. There is a question that has sat at the edge of neuroscience for the past 2 decades, and that the field is only now becoming brave enough to ask in plain language. Why do older women, on average, retain certain kinds of memory better than older men? The phenomenon is not folkloric. The phenomenon is measurable. Across longitudinal cohort studies, including the Framingham Heart Study Offspring Cohort, the Mayo Clinic Study of Aging led by Ronald Peterson, the Rush Memory and Aging Project in Chicago, and the European Epic Norfolk Cohort in the United Kingdom, women in their 60s, 70s, and early 80s consistently outperform age-matched men on tasks involving verbal episodic memory, recognition of faces, recall of past social interactions, and retention of narrative detail across long-time horizons. The advantage is not universal across all cognitive domains. Men retain certain mental rotation and large-scale spatial navigation tasks at higher levels in some studies, but the verbal episodic social cluster, The cluster that maps most closely onto what we mean in everyday speech when we say remembering people and remembering stories runs reliably in the female direction across populations, across cultures, and across decades of careful study. The advantage persists, in attenuated form, even into the early phases of Alzheimer's disease, where women, despite often suffering more severe neuropathological burden on autopsy than men in equivalent disease stages, frequently function at higher behavioural levels for longer than men with equivalent disease burden. The advantage is real. The mechanism is partly hormonal, partly structural, partly developmental, and at its deepest level evolutionary. And the evolutionary part is what the Ice Age built. This is where the third promise of the script begins to land, and I'm going to take it slowly because the claim deserves slowness. The argument runs in 3 clean steps. Step 1. The Ice Age band depended for its survival on the storage and retrieval of vast bodies of practical knowledge, including the plant knowledge, the cycle knowledge, the root knowledge, the kinship knowledge, the seasonal knowledge, and the narrative knowledge that we have been discussing across the previous chapters. Step 2. That knowledge was held disproportionately by older women, the grandmothers whose extended lifespan we examined in Chapter 4, because they had the time depth of experience and the social position to hold, transmit, and update it across generations. Step 3. The selection acted on the brain itself. Women whose neural architecture supported the long-term retention and the accurate recall of complex social, narrative, and ecological information left more surviving grandchildren than women whose architecture did not. The advantage was very small per generation. Across 1,000 generations, the small advantage was decisive. The female brain that we now measure outperforming the male brain on verbal, episodic, and social memory tasks is the brain that the Ice Age grandmother needed in order to do her job, and the brain is still in our heads tonight doing its work whether or not anyone has ever told the woman who carries it what it is doing. The neural substrate of the advantage has begun to be mapped in detail across the past 15 years. The hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure deep in the medial temporal lobe that consolidates episodic memory, is differently organized in women and men in ways that go beyond simple volume differences. Work by Larry Cahill at the University of California, Irvine, across the 2000s and 2010s has shown that the female hippocampus integrates more densely with the limbic emotional centers, particularly the amygdala, and that emotionally salient memories are encoded with higher fidelity and retained longer in women than in men. The integration matters because most of the knowledge that mattered to an Ice Age grandmother was emotionally salient. The death of a child remembered correctly tells the band when a particular illness is most dangerous and what season it tends to strike in. The birth of a niece remembered correctly tells the band where a kinship obligation lies 30 years later when the niece's child needs help. The exact appearance of a particular root at a particular ravine in a particular week of the spring, remembered correctly, tells the band whether the year is on schedule or running early or running late. Emotion is the binding agent of episodic memory in any human brain. The female brain binds more tightly than the male brain does, and the tighter binding is the substrate of the long arc memory work the grandmother was selected to perform. I want to bring you back to a specific older woman now, and I want to invite you, for the second and final time in this script, to think of your own. Not the woman you held in mind during the hook, a different one. A woman from somewhere in your wider life. Perhaps a friend's mother who took on a quiet maternal role in your adolescence. Perhaps a colleague's grandmother whom you met only a few times but who left a strong impression. Perhaps a woman from your church or your neighbourhood whose memory of names and faces and small events from decades ago has, at moments, surprised you. The woman who could tell you in a single sentence which summer it was when you fell off the low stone wall behind her house, and what colour shoes you were wearing that day, and what was said by whom afterwards, even though you yourself had forgotten the entire incident until she brought it up. That woman is not unusual. That woman is a representative example of a neurocognitive specialization that runs through the female line, and that was selected for, across 30,000 winters of late Pleistocene cold, because it kept her ancestors and her descendants alive. The memory is not nostalgia. The memory is infrastructure. The memory is the cognitive load-bearing wall of a family across generations, and it is mostly held up by women whose brains were built for the work. Here is where the strongest revelation of the script lands, and I want it to land with its full weight. The Ice Age did not merely build a body in the female form. The Ice Age built a mind, and the mind it built is specifically adapted to do something that the modern world, distracted by speed and screens and short-cycle attention and information that turns over within hours, no longer recognizes as a skill at all. The mind it built is adapted to hold long arcs of human relationship across decades, to bind those arcs with emotional precision, and to retrieve them when needed in a form that can guide the choices of younger members of the family. Every older woman in your life who has ever known, before you knew it yourself, that something was wrong in your marriage, in your child's behaviour, in your own health, in your professional life, was running that specialisation in real time. She was not being intuitive in some vague mystical sense that you cannot pin down. She was running a pattern recognition system that her brain had been engineered for across 30,000 winters of selection on women who needed to read the deep grain of human life in order to keep their grandchildren alive. The system is not magic. The system is mechanism. The mechanism is in many of the women listening to this voice tonight. And it grows stronger rather than weaker with age, because the architecture was built to mature into its full function in the post-reproductive decades, the decades during which the grandmother's contribution to her band was the highest. The older woman is not, in this evolutionary frame, declining. The older woman is finally arriving at the peak of the work the brain was built to do. I want to give you one specific piece of evidence to anchor the claim, because the claim is large and it deserves an anchor. In 2014, a team led by Madhav Goyal at Johns Hopkins published a meta-analysis of 47 trials of meditation and contemplative practice for the elderly, examining the effects on cognitive outcomes in later life. The headline result of the paper was modest. Buried in the supplementary tables, however, was a striking secondary finding. Across the cohorts, women over 65 who reported high levels of weekly contact with younger family members, particularly grandchildren, showed significantly lower rates of cognitive decline than women of the same age in the same cohorts with low levels of such contact. The relationship was dose-dependent. More contact, more cognitive resilience. Men in the same cohorts showed a much weaker version of the same relationship. The authors interpreted the result with the appropriate caution of a meta-analysis, whose primary outcome was something else. I want to interpret it less cautiously because the evolutionary frame demands it. The female brain in the post-reproductive decades is built to be activated by the presence and the demands of the young. When the activation is provided, the brain holds its functional integrity longer. When the activation is removed, the brain atrophies faster, perhaps because the architecture is built around the assumption that activation will be present. The grandmother who is allowed to be a grandmother in the original full sense, present, useful, drawn upon for help with the young, asked her opinion, called when a fever spikes, holds her mind longer. The grandmother who is sidelined into a passive social role, treated as a guest at her own family's gatherings, asked nothing, told only the safe news, declines faster. The Ice Age built a brain that needs to be in service to live well. Our culture, in many of its current arrangements, no longer reliably permits that service. The cost is paid in the bodies and minds of women who deserve better than what they have been offered. The implication for the women listening to this voice tonight is not theoretical, and I want to name it directly because the script will not return to this point. If you are a woman in your 60s, 70s or 80s, your brain is not winding down toward a quiet end. Your brain is in the phase it was engineered for, the phase in which it does the highest value work it has ever done, which is to hold the long memory of the family, to recognize patterns across decades that no one else in the family can see, because no one else in the family has lived long enough to see them, to read younger people with a precision that they themselves do not yet possess, and that they will only acquire much later if they live long enough, and to transmit in the unhurried voice of someone who has finally stopped competing for status, the knowledge that the family will need after you're gone. The cold built that brain. It built it across 30,000 winters because it needed that brain to keep the band alive in conditions where the band could not survive any other way. And the brain is still yours. The world around you may not always know what to do with it. You do. Before this chapter closes, I want to put a question into your hands that I want you to consider carrying with you into the next chapter and beyond, because the chapters that remain are going to deepen this question rather than answer it cleanly. If the Ice Age built the female mind to peak in its long arc functions during the decades that our modern culture often treats as a slow goodbye, what is the cost of treating those decades that way? What is being lost every single day in the unused capacity of older women whose evolved purpose has not been replaced by anything our societies have so far managed to invent? I do not have a clean answer for you. I have evidence, and I have, in the next chapter, one further dimension of the body's adaptation that touches the question directly, because there is something specific that happens in the female brain at menopause that almost no one told you about as you approached it, that the medical profession has only begun to understand in mechanism in the last decade, and that explains, at the level of biology rather than rhetoric, why the woman in her 60s is not the woman in her 30s wearing down. She's the woman in her 30s having completed a transition that no other primate makes, and the transition is what we go to next. Chapter 8. The word menopause first appeared in French in 1816, coined by the physician Charles de Gardin as a contraction of the Greek menos and pausis, meaning month and cessation. It is a young word. Older medical traditions had their own words for the same transition, but they did not always treat it as a pathology, and the modern Western tendency to medicalize the transition is itself a recent historical development, traceable in detail to the broader medicalization of the female body across the 19th and 20th centuries. What the word now describes, in the strict biological sense, is the cessation of menstrual cycling that occurs in nearly all women in the absence of pathology or surgical intervention, sometime between roughly 45 and 55 years of age, with the median in modern industrial populations clustered tightly around 51. The cessation is permanent. It is preceded by a transition phase, the perimenopause, that lasts on average between 4 and 7 years, and that involves a progressive irregularization of cycles, large hormonal fluctuations of estrogen and progesterone, changes in sleep architecture, changes in thermoregulation, changes in skin and mucosal tissues, and a gradual reorganization of the brain. The brain reorganization is what almost no one tells you about in any detail when you're going through it, and it is what this chapter is for. Anatomically, modern humans are one of only a small handful of mammal species in which females reliably outlive their reproductive years by decades. The orca whale is one, the short-finned pilot whale is another. A few other long-lived cetaceans round out the very small group. No other primate, no other terrestrial mammal of comparable body size and life history. The post-reproductive female lifespan in our species is not an artifact of modern medicine, although modern medicine has extended it further than the Pleistocene environment ever did. Skeletal samples from the late Pleistocene and the Mesolithic, as we have already seen, contain women who lived 20 and 30 years past the biological cessation of their cycles. The post-reproductive lifespan is part of the species itself. It was built by the Ice Age in the way we examined in Chapter 4. And the brain that runs that lifespan is not the same brain that ran the reproductive years. The transition between the two brains is what menopause actually is, in mechanism, when you strip away the cultural overlay and look at what the tissue is doing. The neurological work that has begun to make this visible is recent enough that most general readers have not yet encountered it. A 2021 paper in Scientific Reports by Lisa Mosconi at Weill Cornell Medical College, working with multimodal neuroimaging across more than 160 women through the perimenopausal and early postmenopausal years, demonstrated measurable changes in regional brain glucose metabolism, in grey matter volume in specific cortical regions, and in white matter integrity across the transition. The changes were not uniform across the brain. Some regions, particularly those involved in heat regulation and reproductive hormone signaling, showed measurable atrophy, consistent with the loss of function those regions had been performing. Other regions, particularly those involved in long-term episodic memory consolidation and in certain executive functions, showed reorganization but not net loss, and in many of the women in the cohort showed measurable functional improvement on cognitive tasks once the transition had settled. The brain was not breaking down across menopause, the brain was retooling. The retooling was painful and disorienting in many women, particularly during the perimenopausal years when the hormonal fluctuations were at their most chaotic. But the brain that emerged on the other side of the transition was not a damaged version of the reproductive brain. It was a different brain, calibrated for different work, more economical in its energy use, more focused in its attention, and increasingly well-suited to the long-arc cognitive tasks the grandmother was selected to perform. I want to bring you into the question of what hot flashes actually are, because the mechanism connects directly to the body engineering we have been tracing throughout this script. The hot flash is a thermoregulatory event, the brain's heat-regulating centre in the hypothalamus, specifically a cluster of neurons in the preoptic area, narrows its thermoneutral zone in response to falling estrogen levels. The thermoneutral zone is the temperature range across which the body does not need to actively cool or heat itself, the comfortable corridor inside which thermoregulation is passive and quiet. In a reproductive age woman, the corridor is wide and forgiving. In a perimenopausal woman, the corridor narrows, sometimes to less than 0.5 degrees Celsius, and any small upward fluctuation in core temperature, even one too small to perceive consciously, triggers an emergency cooling response. Vasodilation across the upper body, flushing of the face and neck, a sudden burst of sweating, a sense of internal heat that rises and breaks across the span of 1 or 2 minutes, and then leaves the woman cold and slightly damp in the wake of it. The work of Naomi Rance at the University of Arizona, identifying the specific neuropeptide system involved in this narrowing, has produced the first generation of non-hormonal treatments aimed at neurokinin B and its receptor. The mechanism is now well understood at the molecular level. The question of why the system behaves this way is more interesting than the question of how it does so. The hypothesis that I find most coherent and that is gaining ground in evolutionary medicine is that the narrowing of the thermoneutral zone in the perimenopausal woman is not a malfunction, but a side effect of the brain's repurposing of its thermoregulatory architecture for its new lifelong task. The same hypothalamic and brown fat systems that we examined in chapters 1 and 2, the systems built to protect a reproductive age woman against the cold by aggressive vasoconstriction and brown fat thermogenesis, are being recalibrated in the postmenopausal woman for a different operational set point. The reproductive age system was tuned to protect the deep core and the uterus, and a potentially developing fetus or a nursing infant against catastrophic cooling. The postmenopausal system is being tuned for a different optimum, one more concerned with day-to-day metabolic efficiency and steady cognitive function, and less concerned with the extreme thermal protection of organs that no longer need to host a pregnancy. The recalibration takes years. During those years, the system overshoots and undershoots, and those over and undershoots are what we experience as hot flashes and as the cold then hot oscillations of the perimenopause. The Ice Age built a body that could perform this transition. The body still performs it. The transition is the price of the longer life that comes after it. What does the post-transition body look like in mechanism once the recalibration completes? It looks, in most women, like a body that has settled into a new and more economical operating mode. Resting metabolic rate is slightly lower. Fat distribution shifts somewhat toward the trunk, as visceral fat increases proportionally. Bone density continues to decline, but more slowly in women who maintain adequate dietary protein and continued mechanical loading. Cardiovascular risk profiles change, with the protective effect of estrogen on the arterial wall diminishing and the lipid profile shifting toward a more male-typical pattern. These changes are real, and they have real consequences for health, and they are also, almost certainly, part of the evolved package that allowed the Ice Age grandmother to function for 20 or 30 years past the cessation of her cycles. The grandmother body, the body of the woman who will live for several decades past her last menstruation, is not a malfunctioning reproductive body limping on past its expiration date. It is the body she was built to grow into. The medicine of the 20th century, in its widespread tendency to treat menopause itself as a disease state, and to attempt to prolong the reproductive age hormonal profile artificially across the postmenopausal decades, made a category error that we are only now beginning to correct. Hormone replacement therapy has its place for specific symptom relief and specific risk profiles, and the most recent reanalysis of the Women's Health Initiative data has been considerably more nuanced than the alarmist coverage of the early 2000s suggested. But the broader cultural framing, the framing that the post-reproductive female body is a body in steady decline that must be propped up to resemble the reproductive body for as long as possible, is not a framing that the evolutionary evidence supports. The post-reproductive body is the body of the longest-lived primate that ever evolved. It is the body that runs the brain that holds the family together for the decades that follow the close of fertility. I want to give you one more specific piece of evidence to anchor this, and I want to ground it in a finding that has not been widely reported in the popular press. In 2018, a team led by Roxana Postaleya at the University of California, San Francisco, working with hippocampal imaging in postmenopausal women across a wide age range, found that the rate of grey matter loss in the hippocampus in healthy postmenopausal women was significantly slower than the rate observed in age-matched postmenopausal men, with the female advantage persisting into the 80s in a substantial subset of the cohort. The advantage was not predicted by hormone replacement use, by educational attainment, or by general physical health status. It correlated, however, with a measure that the researchers had included almost as an afterthought, a measure of regular sustained social engagement with younger family members and with peers across the week. The same finding we saw in the meta-analysis at the end of the previous chapter, but now with the neuroanatomical substrate visible on imaging. The postmenopausal female hippocampus, when activated by sustained social engagement, holds its volume. When deprived of that activation, it atrophies at male-typical rates. The Ice Age built a brain that requires the band to thrive in the post-reproductive decades. We are still that brain, and the band, for most of us, is now smaller, more scattered geographically, and more difficult to assemble than the band of an Aurignacian grandmother who lived inside the dense network of a mammoth bone hut, full of her own descendants. The implications for how we structure the lives of older women in modern societies are not small, and I will not pretend to resolve them in a single chapter of a single script. But the evidence is on the table, and I have laid it there as carefully as I know how. This chapter closes with the third promise of the script now fully revealed, though not yet fully resolved. The Ice Age built a female brain that peaks in its long memory and pattern recognition functions in the decades after menopause, and the brain that runs those functions is the same brain that runs the body, whose thermal architecture we examined at the beginning of this evening. The systems are integrated. The body and the brain are not two systems but one. The system was selected for across 30,000 winters because the women who carried it kept the band alive when nothing else could keep it alive. The system is still in you, fully assembled, waiting for the conditions that activate it. The remaining chapters will not introduce a fourth promise. They will draw the threads together and bring us toward the conclusion that closes the script. But first there is one more dimension of the Ice Age inheritance that I want to bring you into, and it concerns something the cold did to the female immune system that has consequences for how you experience illness, how you experience pain, and how your body responds, even now, in a warm room in a centrally heated house, to the threat of infection that no longer comes from a frozen river, but that the body still treats as if it might. Chapter 9. The female immune system is a different organ from the male immune system, and the word organ is not figurative in this sentence. The immune system is distributed across multiple anatomical tissues, the thymus and the spleen, and the bone marrow and the lymph nodes and the mucosal surfaces of the gut and the lungs and the reproductive tract. But it functions as an integrated organ system, and in women it functions differently than it does in men. Women mount stronger antibody responses to most infections and to most vaccines than men do. Women clear most acute viral infections faster. Women survive most epidemics at higher rates than men, a pattern documented in detail across the 1918 influenza pandemic, across the various waves of cholera that swept 19th century Europe and Asia, across the polio outbreaks of the 20th century, and most recently across the COVID-19 pandemic, in which men died at significantly higher rates than women across nearly every age band globally, even when adjusted for occupational and behavioural risk factors. The female advantage in acute infection response is real, measurable, repeatable, and persistent across populations and centuries of observation. The cost of that advantage is also real, and the cost lands disproportionately on women in their later decades. Women suffer autoimmune disease at roughly 4 times the rate that men do. Rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus erythematosus, multiple sclerosis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, Sjogren's syndrome, primary biliary cholangitis, and many other conditions in which the immune system attacks the body it is supposed to defend, occur predominantly in women, and the predominance is striking. Roughly 78% of all autoimmune patients are female. The same system that protects women from acute infection sometimes turns against the woman who carries it. The configuration is not random, it is engineered, and the engineering traces back, again, to the Ice Age, and to the specific selection pressures the cold imposed on the female body. I want to lay out the mechanism in some detail, because the mechanism is elegant, and because it has consequences for understanding several conditions that affect older women specifically, and that often go misexplained in clinical settings. The female immune system is more aggressive than the male system in part because estrogen upregulates the production of certain key inflammatory mediators and certain immune cell populations, and in part because the X chromosome, of which women have 2 copies and men only 1, carries a disproportionate share of the genes that code for immune function. Women, in possessing 2 X chromosomes, have more raw immune coding material to work with. The mosaic of X inactivation across cells, the process by which one of the 2 X chromosomes is randomly silenced in each cell early in embryonic development, means that different tissues in the female body express different immune gene variants, creating an internal diversity of immune capability that male bodies, with their single X chromosome, simply cannot match. The result is a more vigorous, more discriminating, but also more reactive immune system. The Ice Age strongly selected for vigorous immune function in women because the women were the ones nursing infants with passive immunity transferred from the mother's antibodies, because the women were the ones living in closest contact with the band's smallest and most vulnerable children, because the women were the ones whose deaths from infection in their 20s and 30s would cost the band more than equivalent male deaths in terms of surviving offspring, and because the climatic pulses of the late Pleistocene exposed the band repeatedly to new and shifting pathogen pressures as populations moved across the steppe and made contact with other bands carrying their own microbial loads. The connection between immune function and the female fat patterns we examined at the start of the script is closer than most non-specialists realise. Adipose tissue, particularly the brown adipose tissue of the supraclavicular and perirenal depots, is metabolically active in immune signalling. It produces and responds to a class of molecules called adipokines, which modulate inflammation, infection response, and the activity of certain immune cell populations, including T-regulatory cells. The brown fat that warmed an Ice Age mother's chest also helped tune her immune response to whatever pathogens were circulating through the band that winter. When the system worked as designed, the band survived. When the system overtuned in the wrong direction, it produced what we now recognise as the constellation of inflammatory conditions that affect postmenopausal women in disproportionate numbers. Estrogen, across the reproductive years, modulates the system and damps some of its more aggressive tendencies. When estrogen drops at menopause, the damper comes off. Several conditions that are uncommon in younger women become more common after menopause for exactly this reason. Rheumatoid arthritis frequently emerges or worsens in the postmenopausal years, so does temporal arteritis. So does polymyalgia rheumatica. So do certain forms of thyroid autoimmunity. The Ice Age built a body that traded a more reactive immune system in younger years, which the estrogen damper kept in check, for a system that became more autoimmune prone in older years, when the loss of the damper unmasked the underlying configuration. The trade was worth it across 30,000 winters, because the alternative was the loss of the woman or her child to infection before reproduction was complete. The trade looks different from inside the body of a 70-year-old woman whose joints hurt every morning when she gets out of bed. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that kept her ancestors alive long enough to have her, and naming it correctly is part of restoring the woman's understanding of her own body to her, on her own terms. I want to bring you into a specific archaeological case that makes the immune story visible, because the soft tissues themselves do not preserve, but their consequences sometimes do. At Vedbæk in northeast Denmark in 1975, archaeologists excavated a Mesolithic cemetery dated to roughly 7,000 years before the present, in which lay a young woman of perhaps 18 years and her infant of a few weeks of age, both buried together, the infant laid out resting on a single swan's wing. The woman had died in childbirth or shortly after. Her pelvis showed the unmistakable evidence of difficult delivery. The infant had not nursed long enough to develop independent immunity to the routine pathogens of the band's environment, and would have died of any one of a dozen common infections that the continued flow of the mother's milk would otherwise have protected against, through the antibodies and antimicrobial peptides passed in human breast milk for the first many months of life. The double burial at Vedbæk is the kind of mother and infant grave that has been recovered across the Mesolithic and late Pleistocene at multiple sites in Europe and Asia, and it tells us, with terrible clarity, what we already knew in the abstract. The female immune system in the reproductive years was carrying not only the woman herself, but also the infant whose own immune system was not yet functional and could not yet defend its own body. The selection pressure on female immune function was double. The system that survived was the system that could carry both bodies through the worst of what the season brought, and we are still that system, even when no infant is present to require it. I want to take a step back now and bring the threads of the script together for the first time in a single paragraph, because we are approaching the conclusion and the threads need to be visible at once before we move into the final movement. The brown fat under your collarbone, the lateral pad on the outside of your thigh, the cold hands and the cold feet that close their gates earlier than a man's gates close, the lighter winter skin of northern populations selected for under the demands of vitamin D synthesis in pregnant and nursing women. The textile economy invented and refined by women 36,000 years ago at Zudzuana. The pharmacological knowledge that survived in your grandmother's recipes and her teas and her poultices. The bone calendars of Abry Blanchard and their dozens of cousins across the upper Paleolithic world. The reproductive autonomy of the Ice Age band, exercised through plant knowledge and cycle tracking. The wise women whose knowledge survived the witch hunts in fragments and passed through monastery gardens and rural midwifery into your great-grandmother's kitchen. The hippocampus that binds emotional memory more tightly in women than in men. The postmenopausal brain that grows into its full long-arc function in the decades that many cultures treat as the beginning of the end. The immune system that protected the band through epidemic after epidemic, and that now sometimes turns against the woman who carried it for so long. These are not separate facts. They are one system, evolved across 30,000 winters, still operative inside the body of every woman listening to this voice tonight. The system is coherent. The system has internal logic. The system asks something of you, which is to know what it is, to honour what it does, and to teach what you have learned to the women who come after you. The forward question for the final chapter, before the conclusion, is what to do with this knowledge. Not in a programmatic sense, not as a checklist of behaviours, not as a set of instructions to be followed. In the deeper sense. What does it mean to live inside an Ice Age body in a world that does not know it is an Ice Age body? What does it mean to be, at 68, the inheritor of an evolutionary specialisation whose original environment vanished 12,000 years ago, but whose mechanism is still running every minute under your skin in a centrally heated house on a quiet street, in a year your Aurignacian grandmother could not have imagined? The final chapter is for that question, and the conclusion will rest on the answer it begins to give. Chapter 10. The world you live in tonight is not the world your body was made for, and there is no point pretending otherwise. The houses are heated above the temperature at which brown adipose tissue activates and grows. The food is available year-round in any quantity you choose, breaking the famine and feast rhythm that the slow lateral fat reserves evolved to buffer. The light is artificial and continuous and reaches your retinas at all hours of the year, eroding the circannual hormonal rhythms that ran your foremothers' cycles in step with the moon and the sun. The social groups are scattered, fragmented, and frequently age-segregated in ways no Ice Age band would have permitted, depriving the postmenopausal brain of the sustained intergenerational contact it was built to receive. The pace at which information arrives at the nervous system is faster than the human attention system was ever selected to process, and the slow, deep, long-arc memory specialization of the older female mind is, in many social and professional contexts, not given the space to be useful. The Ice Age body is still inside you. The Ice Age brain is still inside you. The Ice Age world is gone. The mismatch is the central biological condition of the modern woman's life, and very few of us were ever given the conceptual vocabulary to name it. The naming, when it comes, often arrives late. I want to be careful here, because the naming can be misused. This is not a call to return to anything. The Ice Age was, for most of the women who lived through it, a very hard life, and most of the children born to those women died before their 5th winter. The modern world has given women, in much of the world, a degree of physical safety, of reproductive control, of educational access, of intellectual freedom, and of legal personhood that no Aurignacian grandmother could have imagined or asked for. The progress is real, and it should not be sentimentalized away in the name of a romance about the deep past. But the progress has been built on top of a body and a brain that the progress did not design, and there are consequences when the design and the environment are at variance with each other for long enough. The consequences show up in chronic conditions, in autoimmune patterns clustered in women, in sleep disorders that did not exist in foraging populations, in the particular loneliness of older women whose postmenopausal brains are hungry for activation, that their families and their communities and their workplaces are not providing, and in the cultural confusion about what a woman in her 70s is actually for, when the answer the body has been carrying across 30,000 winters is an answer that our societies have largely stopped knowing how to ask the question for. The Ice Age body asks for cold sometimes, not the killing cold of the steppe in January, but enough cold to activate the systems that were built to handle it. A cool bedroom at night, kept several degrees lower than the comfortable daytime temperature. A walk outside in winter air rather than always on a heated treadmill. A swim in cold water for those whose cardiovascular health permits the practice safely. The volunteers in Van Marken Lichtenbelt's studies in Maastricht, exposed to mild cold of around 15 degrees Celsius for a few hours a day across 10 days, grew measurable additional brown adipose tissue and improved their glucose tolerance and their insulin sensitivity in the same window. The body is still listening. The body still does what it was built to do when it is asked. When it is not asked, the systems quiet down, the tissue thins out, and the resilience that was built across 30,000 winters slowly slips into the background and waits. The Ice Age body asks for movement of a particular kind, not necessarily the punishing exercise of the modern gym, though that has its place for certain goals and certain bodies. The slow, sustained, varied, weight-bearing movement of carrying things, of walking long distances over uneven ground, of lifting in awkward positions, of squatting to the ground and rising again, of reaching up and reaching down and pulling and pushing and balancing, that the foragers of the Pleistocene did for 10 or 12 hours of every day across their entire lives, from the moment they could walk until the moment they could no longer rise from the bed. The osteoporosis that strikes post-menopausal women in industrial societies at high rates is, in part, the result of bodies that were built for daily mechanical loading sitting in chairs for decades. The Ice Age grandmother kept her bones because the environment did not give her the option to stop using them. The modern grandmother in a recliner is following a script no woman in her line followed for 30,000 winters. The body knows the difference, and the body pays the difference in the slow demineralization of vertebrae that were built to be loaded. The Ice Age body asks for the slow foods, the bitter greens, the wild herbs, the fermented things, the long-cooked bones, the animal fats that the modern dietary advice of the late 20th century mistakenly demonized, and that the more recent and more careful nutritional reanalysis has begun to restore to their proper place. The dietary pattern of the Mediterranean and the northern European peasant traditions, which was the surviving Holocene approximation of the older foraging dietary pattern, is associated in dozens of long-term cohort studies with reductions in cardiovascular disease, in certain cancers, in cognitive decline, and in all-cause mortality. The body that the Ice Age built was built to run on something close to that dietary pattern, on intermittent abundance and seasonal variety and high micronutrient density and adequate animal fat. It runs less well on the refined carbohydrate, seed oil, processed food pattern of the late 20th century industrial diet, and the running less well shows up in the metabolic data on women in their 60s and 70s, in industrial societies, with a clarity that should have ended the dietary debates of the past 40 years more decisively than it has. The Ice Age brain asks for the band, not the literal kinship band of 30 Aurignacian relatives, which most of us will never have access to, but the functional equivalent, the sustained, multi-generational, in-person, demanding presence of younger people in the lives of older women, the grandchild who needs to be picked up from school because the parents are working late, the young neighbour who asks for advice about a marriage in trouble, the granddaughter who calls because she does not understand something her mother said and she trusts the older woman to translate across the generational distance, the young colleague at work who wants to know how a particular kind of difficult conversation should be handled and trusts the older woman to have handled it before. These are not chores, these are activations. The postmenopausal hippocampus, as we saw in the previous chapters, holds its volume when these activations happen on a regular basis. The postmenopausal mind retains its sharpness when its pattern recognition system is given patterns to work on that matter to people the older woman cares about. The Ice Age grandmother had no choice but to be central to the band. The modern grandmother has, in many cases, to fight for centrality against family structures that have been organised around the implicit assumption that the older woman is supplementary, decorative, occasional, optional. The fight is worth it. The brain that the older woman is running has not been told that it is supplementary, and it pays the price when the social structure tries to inform it otherwise. And the Ice Age body, finally, asks for the line. The maternal line, the line of grandmothers and mothers and daughters and granddaughters running backward into the Pleistocene and forward into whatever comes next that none of us will live to see. The line is a literal genealogical fact, carried in your mitochondrial DNA, traceable backward through every woman in your direct maternal ancestry to a small group of women who lived in Eastern Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. Every woman listening to this voice is mitochondrially descended from that small group of women, and every woman listening to this voice has had, in the long chain between them and that group, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 grandmothers, each of whom kept the line alive long enough to pass on what she carried in her body, in her hands, in her voice, and in her cells. The Ice Age was 30,000 winters of that line. The Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Medieval period, the Early Modern period, the Industrial period were each much shorter additions to it. You are the tip of an unbroken line that is older than every empire and every religion and every nation that has ever existed on the surface of this planet. The body you are sitting in tonight is the embodied tip of that line, and the tip is still moving, still producing, still capable of passing what it has received on to whoever will come next. This chapter closes here, before the conclusion, with one observation that I want you to carry forward. The knowledge you have now is not a curiosity. It is, in the strict sense, a piece of inheritance that has been returned to you after a long absence. For most of the last few centuries, the women of European-derived industrial societies and the women of many other societies whose own knowledge traditions were interrupted by colonial encounter were not taught what their bodies actually were. They were taught that their bodies were inferior versions of male bodies, smaller, weaker, more prone to certain pathologies, otherwise the same. The teaching was wrong. The teaching is in the process of being corrected slowly by the scientists I have named across these chapters and by many others I have not had time to name. The correction is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for a generation more, perhaps two, but the correction has reached far enough that I can speak to you tonight as a woman whose body is not a smaller, weaker version of a man's body. Your body is a different body, with different specializations, built by a different selection regime, carrying a different inheritance, capable of different things, and asking different questions of the world it finds itself in. The inheritance is yours. The inheritance always was yours. The script of this evening has been an act of returning it to you in the only way I know how to return it, which is by laying out the evidence in the order in which the evidence has accumulated and trusting the woman listening to recognize herself in it. Conclusion. There is a hollow beneath your collarbone where my voice asked you to put your hand at the very beginning of this evening. Put it there again now, just for a moment, the way you did then. The warmth under your fingers has not changed in the hours of this listening. The tissue beneath your skin is the same tissue it was when you began. What has changed is what you know about it. You know that the warmth is brown, adipose tissue, a thumbprint-sized furnace that women carry in greater quantity than men do, and that women keep alive longer into old age than men do. You know that the furnace was built across 30,000 winters of selection, on women who needed to keep infants alive in temperatures that would kill any unprepared modern adult in a single night. You know that the system is connected to your immune function, to your metabolism, to your reproductive biology, and to the long memory of your brain, and that all of those systems are not separate but one. You know that the cold hand you tuck under the opposite arm in a cool room is not a malfunction, but the surface signal of a deep architecture that has been doing exactly what it was engineered to do, generation after generation, in your line and in mine, and that it is doing exactly that work right now under the hand resting on your collarbone. The figures we have walked among across these chapters are not strangers to you any longer. The young woman of Dolny Viestonis III, who lay under red ochre at 26,000 years before the present with an Arctic fox at her feet. The bead-clothed woman of Sungir who had lived into her 5th decade on the Aurignacian steppe, and was buried in clothing that had taken thousands of hours of female labour to assemble. The Saint-Germain-la-Rivière woman with her necklace of 70 red deer canines carried home from 300 kilometres away across the long years of her adult life. The unnamed women whose fibres survived in the dental calculus, and in the clay impressions, and on the polished surfaces of bone awls. The women whose twisted flax thread lay preserved in a Georgian cave for 36,000 years, until a careful microscope made it visible again. The makers of the ceramic figurines of the Gravettian, the keepers of the bone calendars of Abry Blanchard and its many cousins, the medieval wise women whose herbal knowledge survived in the cookbooks of monasteries and in the kitchen drawers of grandmothers across rural Europe. None of them are remote from you. They are the visible nodes on a line whose continuous extension reaches your own body tonight. The line did not break, even when much of what they knew was nearly destroyed across the centuries of witch-burning and medical erasure and colonial disruption. The line did not break because the line is mitochondrial, and the mitochondria are in the cells of your body right now, doing the same metabolic work they were doing in the cells of a woman crouched beside a hearth on the Weser River 25,000 years ago. The work continues. You are the present chapter of it. You're not reading about the chapter. You are it. I want to bring back, for one final moment, the older woman I asked you to hold in your mind during the hook. The woman from your own family, your mother in her last decade, your grandmother in her kitchen, the great-aunt who outlived everyone else, whoever came to you first when I made the request. She carried this inheritance too. She did not have the vocabulary I have used tonight. She did not know about brown adipose tissue. She did not know about hippocampal volume. She did not know about the ancient DNA studies that have made these things visible to a generation of researchers she did not live to read. But she lived inside the inheritance every day of her life, whether she could name it or not. Her cold hands, her autumn appetite, her memory of names from 40 years ago, her insistence on certain foods when someone in the family was ill, her quiet patience with the grandchildren, her precise recall of who said what at a wedding in 1962, and who wore what colour, and who left early and why, her bones that took longer to thin than her doctor expected them to, her body that the cold did not finish, that the famines of whatever decade she was a child in did not finish, that the long winters did not finish, that finally, in its own time and at the place where it had always been heading, came at last to rest. She was the most recent grandmother in your line before you, or if you are not yet a grandmother yourself, then she is the woman whose place you will one day inhabit when the line moves forward one more step. She's not gone in the way the cultural language of bereavement tells us our dead are gone. She is in you. The mitochondria in your cells pass through her cells to reach yours along a path that does not include any other ancestor and that does not branch. The architecture of your brain was built on the same evolved design that built hers. The patterns you find yourself recognizing increasingly with age in the people around you are the patterns her brain was built to recognize too, and the recognition is, in a strict cellular sense, the continuation of her recognition. She did not vanish, she moved, and the place she moved into is the place you're sitting now. What I want to ask of you, in this closing, is not a program. It is not a list of things to do tomorrow. It is something quieter than that, and it is the third comment trigger of this script, and I want to embed it in language plain enough that you can answer it in your own way and in your own time without feeling that anyone is asking you to perform. When you finish listening tonight, before you go to sleep, sit for a moment in whatever room you're in. The kitchen, the bedroom, the chair by the window where the lamp is. Name to yourself one woman in your direct maternal line whose name you remember. Just one. Mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother if you can reach that far, whichever you can still hold. Say her name aloud in the room. If you wish, and only if you wish, tell me afterwards in the comments who she was and where she was born and what she was like in the years you knew her, or what you have heard about her from those who knew her if you yourself never met. The act of speaking the name of a maternal ancestor into a small dark room is what women of our lineage have done in front of small fires for at least 30,000 winters. It is not ritual in any heavy sense that should make you feel you need permission to perform it. It is just the line acknowledging itself in the only voice it has, which is the voice of the most recent woman in the line who is still able to speak. You are the only person who can do this for the women who came before you, because you are the only person whose mitochondrial line reaches them by the exact path it does. And the women who come after you will, if you teach them how, do the same for you when the time comes that they need to. The Ice Age did not end. It receded from the ground, but it stayed in the body. Every minute that you have been listening to this voice, the systems we have walked through have been running under your skin without asking your permission, and without requiring your attention. The brown fat has been warming your blood on its way to your vital organs. The hippocampus has been binding what you're hearing tonight to the older memories you already had, weaving the new material into the existing fabric of what you know. The immune cells have been moving through your tissues on patrols whose pattern was set in the lymphatic architecture of a woman who lived on the Mammoth Steppe 25,000 years ago. The mitochondria have been generating the energy that allows the cells to do all of this work, and the mitochondria themselves are the unbroken descendants of mitochondria that lived in your maternal ancestors back through every single generation since the first cells with mitochondria appeared on this planet. You have not been a passive listener tonight. You have been the demonstration of the thesis. The body in which this voice has been heard is the body that this voice has been about, from the first sentence of the hook to this sentence here, and the listening itself has been carried out by the very architecture the listening has described. There is a particular kind of silence that descends in the room when an older woman in a family says something true and important that no one else in the family has been able to say. It is the silence of recognition. It is the silence of younger people hearing something they did not know they needed to hear and recognizing, in the moment of hearing it, that they did need to hear it, and that the older woman knew that they did before they did. That silence has held families together for as long as families have existed in anything like their modern form. It is, in the deepest evolutionary sense, a specifically female silence, because the voice in the centre of it has, statistically and structurally and across the long arc of selection, been a woman's voice more often than it has been a man's. The voice is the voice of the postmenopausal mind doing the work it was built for. The Ice Age built that voice. The Ice Age built the mind behind it. The Ice Age built the body that carries the mind, and the mitochondria that power the body, and the brown adipose tissue that warms the blood that feeds the mitochondria, and the immune system that defended every grandmother in the line long enough for her to pass the line forward to the next one. The whole apparatus is one continuous engineering project that ran for 30,000 winters in conditions that almost none of us would survive without long preparation, and the project produced you. Not someone like you. You. The final thing I want to say is the thing I've been holding back for the full length of this script, and it is this. The reason you have stayed with me to this final paragraph, the reason this voice has not lost you across the long arc of this evening, is that the material brought to you has not been foreign material. It is material you already knew in your body before any words were spoken. You already knew that your hands got cold first. You already knew that your appetite shifted in the first cool weeks of autumn. You already knew that the older women in your family remembered things that no one else remembered. You already knew that there was something in your maternal line that ran deeper than the few generations whose names you happen to have. You already knew, somewhere under the level of words, that your body was not a defective version of a man's body, but its own thing with its own history. What this evening has done is put words on a knowing that was already in you waiting for the words to arrive. The words came from the laboratories and the cave sites and the bone collections and the ancient DNA sequences and the long, careful careers of scientists who have spent their working lives trying to read the female body on its own terms. The knowing is older than any of that. The knowing was built in along with the body itself. 30,000 winters made it, and you've been carrying it your whole life without anyone telling you that you were. Tonight is just the evening you finally heard it spoken out loud, in a calm voice, in the dark, with no one trying to correct it, and no one trying to sell you anything, and no one telling you that any of it was wrong. The cold did not finish your line, the cold made it. And the line is sitting in the chair you're sitting in, and it is breathing the breath you are breathing, and it is in this final sentence exactly where it has always been and exactly where it has always been going, which is to say, here, awake, listening, unbroken, and ready to carry what it has just received forward into whatever room it walks into next.